Forrest D.Y. Shab. Born sometime in 1984 in Vancouver, Canada, Forrest Shab was a fledgling rap artist when he suddenly vanished in 2010. Known best by his stage name D.Y., an acronym for Die Young, Forrest was a keen musician who'd started making music at the age of 14, going so far as to enter and win several MC competitions and publish much of his own work. In 2009, he signed with CP Records and started work on his debut album, collaborating with one of the label's most prominent artists, a Palestinian-Canadian singer-songwriter and producer known as Belly. Forrest released his first single, Passenger, in October that year, which featured another artist from the label named Danny Fernandez, and it was met with praise. In 2010, Billboard featured the song in their magazine and dubbed Forrest as one of the best emerging Canadian artists. In 2009, Forrest embarked on a Canadian tour. Unfortunately, he never got to see what heights his career would reach. Just before his disappearance, he shot a music video for his second single, That's My Spot, which featured singer D. Woods, best known as a member of the pop group Elaine Khn. Shortly afterwards, he vanished. 26-year-old Forrest made plans to visit Mexico in mid-August of 2010. He was reported missing in Mexico several months later on November 18th, after his family discovered that he had not been heard from since August. In a statement, the family noted, "We haven't heard from Forrest since August. We are extremely worried about him. If anyone has information of his whereabouts, please help us by contacting the Toronto Police Department." According to his Facebook and Twitter pages, Forrest had been active online up until September 8th. After that, things went quiet. His collaborators, Belly and Danny Fernandez, tweeted prayers and asked that the public look out for him, while his management team conducted an online search operation by asking that fans retweet his information in order to spread word of his disappearance. The exact nature of Forrest's trip to Mexico is unclear, and it's also not known why it took his family so long to report him missing. Online rumors claim that Forrest was involved with Hell's Angels, drug cartels, or some other shady life of crime, but no evidence has been found to support this. Forrest's case is still unsolved. Elaine Khn. Born September 14th, 1944, in Paris, France, Alain Zissa, better known by his stage name Elaine Khn, was a French musician whose artistic skill, and the fact he was an openly gay man, set him apart from many of his peers, and caused his career to become shrouded in controversy. Alain was raised by his mother and stepfather, along with his stepsister Veronique. Notably, Veronique would later marry another French musician, known as Christophe, and he grew close to Elaine, with the pair eventually working together to write music. In the spring of 1963, Elaine released his first single. The next year, he launched several EPs, most of which covered music by US and Canadian artists. In the following years, Elaine took a break from recording music to carry out his obligatory military service, and upon his return to the music scene, he began giving live performances in Paris, where he created an androgynous character for himself. During this time, he made connections with other musicians and began songwriting for them, although his most notable track for the French artist Danny was banned from the airwaves for what were seen as salacious lyrics at the time. In the 1970s, Elaine spent time in England, where he became interested in artists like T-Rex, The Velvet Underground, and David Bowie, whom some sources state he spent 10 days with. Inspired by the glam rock of the era, Elaine began to wear makeup for his performances and sang about things that were considered taboo at the time: sex, his sexuality, and his addiction to drugs. In 1975 and 1976, his first two glam rock albums were released, a large departure from his earlier work. Elaine's career was never what it could have been due to censorship. He was repeatedly denied airplay and never promoted. In 1979, his third album was released, which again attracted controversy when he included parts of Adolf Hitler's many speeches on the record. The details about the remainder of Elaine's career and his subsequent disappearance are largely hazy. He appeared to record music for the final time in 1986, but vanished from the spotlight shortly afterwards, with French music website Brain magazine writing that alcohol and drugs were to blame for his departure from the music scene. Elaine began living a much more low-key life, working as a salesman for computer products. Elaine was last seen on April 14, 1990, where he stood on a platform at either the Rue de la Pompe metro station or the Châtelet station in Paris, depending on which witnesses you ask. He has never been seen again. His sister, Veronique, learned of his disappearance 2 days later, after his partner reached out to her because he could not locate Elaine. Veronique, her husband Christophe, and their several friends appealed for further witnesses, but none came forward. A search attempt was made, but nothing of note was found. French singer Daniel Darc later stated in an interview that he had met with Elaine the day before he went missing, and that Elaine had told him about an argument he'd had with his mother and her partner, although it's unclear if this had anything to do with the artist's disappearance. A 2013 program reportedly investigated the possibilities of what might have happened to Elaine, including suicide and murder, the latter result of a lover's quarrel or even an involvement with drug trafficking, but nothing concrete was ever established. Some speculated that Elaine had left to start over elsewhere, leaving behind a life of turmoil and controversy in favor of something quieter. There were reportedly even sightings of him in Switzerland between 1992 and 1994. In 2021, however, his sister shared that she had contacted hospitals at the time of his disappearance and learned that her stepbrother was unwell, possibly the result of HIV, but that he required further testing. She then theorized that Elaine took his own life after learning he was likely HIV positive. Elaine was declared dead in the early 2000s, though his body has never been recovered. What became of him remains a mystery to this day. Joe Crips. Best known for his work in the Grammy Award-winning polka band Brave Combo, Joe Crips was a well-known and revered percussionist. In 2015, he left Denton, Texas, where the band was based, and moved to his hometown of Little Rock, Arkansas, though he continued to visit Denton regularly. By all accounts, he was well known on the music scenes in Arkansas and Texas alike. Joe was last seen in Little Rock on October 19, 2016. That day, he visited White Walter Tavern, but he was eventually refused service because he got too drunk. He subsequently ordered a taxi using his phone, but it's unclear if he actually got one or if he walked home, as he lived only a mile away. The Charlie Project reports that at the time of his disappearance, the 51-year-old had just been paid and may have been carrying a hefty amount of cash with him. Joe was due to play a gig on October 21st, but he failed to show up, which was most unlike him. He has not been seen or heard from since he was at the tavern on the 19th. When he disappeared, he left behind his medication and his drumsticks and mallets, and those who knew him stated he'd never leave without them. Furthermore, he didn't have access to a car at the time he went missing, since his vehicle was in the repair shop. Joe was reported missing by his brother, James, who visited his apartment and discovered all of his belongings inside. Police appealed for information, but found very little. According to the Dallas Observer, Bubba Hernandez, who had once played with Brave Combo, traveled to Arkansas to look for Joe, visiting the tavern where he was last seen and attempting to pick up anything, any tidbit that somebody didn't tell police, or even what local rumors were spreading. However, Bubba found nothing. Joe had reportedly struggled with alcohol throughout most of his life, even going to rehab at least once, though Bubba added it didn't take. At the time of his disappearance, Joe was working at a halfway house, doing odd jobs to earn a living, and his residence was in a reportedly rough area of town. At one point, during his visit to Little Rock, Bubba heard of a body being found on the bank of Arkansas River and had feared the worst, but the body was not Joe's. The investigation has been at a standstill ever since, although Bubba offered to open a GoFundMe for the family so they could hire a private eye. They turned him down, stating that they wanted to let police handle things. Investigators have declined to say whether they think foul play was involved. Joseph Edward Crips was 51 when he vanished from Little Rock, Arkansas on October 19, 2016. He is described as a white man with graying brown hair and blue eyes. He is between 5'7" and 5'10", and weighed around 165 to 185 pounds. Joe often has a large, thick mustache and may have a beard. He takes medication for high blood pressure, which was left behind when he went missing. If Joe is still alive, he will be 59 years old. Anyone with information about his disappearance can contact the Little Rock Police Department on 501-371-4605. Marcela Basteri. Marcela Basteri is an Italian actress who is best known for being the mother of Luis Miguel, one of the biggest Latin music artists on the planet. At the age of 11, Luis released his first album, which won him his first gold disc shortly afterwards. By the age of 13, he was beginning to tour Latin American countries, including Colombia and Argentina, having scored a massive hit with his debut album. Luis's father, best known as Luisito Rey, was a Spanish singer-songwriter and his manager for much of his career, something which led to tension between the two. Luisito was seen to be strict and demanding, and by the late 1980s, the pair's relationship had disintegrated, in part due to financial problems caused by Luisito. Luis subsequently fired his father, and the two became estranged, with Luisito dying in Barcelona, Spain, on December 9, 1992, having suffered from alcoholism and depression in his later years. On the outside, Luisito was seen to be a capable manager and a good songwriter, but others, including Luis's godfather, psychologist Alfred Herger, claimed that he was a psychopath and an abuser. Luisito's own brother alleged that he would force Marcela to sleep with men in order to gain perks or to earn money to fund his drug habit. By all accounts, Luisito was violent and ruthless. Few details are available in Marcela's case. She was last seen on August 18, 1986, in Madrid, Spain. At the time of her trip, her marriage to Luisito was reportedly on the verge of breaking down, and so she visited Carrara, Italy, where she spent 6 months with her younger son, Sergio. Luisito then asked to meet her in Spain in September so they could sign papers related to their son's career. On August 18th, Marcela was dropped off at the airport in Pisa, Italy, for her flight to Madrid. When she arrived, however, Luis was not present as she had expected. Between 20 and 25 days later, she phoned her aunt, Adrien Basteri, and told her she would be going to Chile with her other son and Luisito and would be back in a month's time. But nobody ever heard from Marcela again. 9 months passed before Adrien received a phone call from Marcela's sons who didn't know of her whereabouts and asked if Adrien had seen her. Adrien then reached out to Luisito and Marcela's stepmother, both of whom lived in Spain, but she failed to find any answers. For decades, there was no movement in the case. Luisito claimed that she had run off with a lover, while Luis said he went to look for his mother in Europe but was unable to find her. He has stated simply that he has no idea what became of her. In 2004, Adrien stated her belief that Luisito murdered her in Madrid. There have also been rumors that Marcela was committed to a psychiatric hospital in Italy, but proof to back up either of these theories doesn't exist, or at least it has not been made public. In 2023, Marcela's case received fresh attention when pictures began circulating of an Argentinian woman who resembled the mother of three. The woman, Honorina Montes, was reportedly a patient at the Moyano Psychiatric Hospital in Argentina, and she bears a striking resemblance to Marcela. In fact, her appearance was so similar that she agreed to undergo a DNA test to see if she really was Marcela, but it was proven that she was not. Marcela Basteri is still missing to this day. Liz Barazza. On the morning of January 25th, 2019, Elizabeth Liz Barazza was preparing to host a garage sale to raise extra money for her and her husband's anniversary trip to Florida. Setting up on the driveway of her home on the 8600 block of Cedar Walk Drive, Tomball, Texas, Liz was alone as her husband, Sergio, had just left for work. But just 4 minutes after Sergio departed, a dark-colored Nissan truck pulled up across from their home. The killer then exited the vehicle, approached Liz on the driveway, and pulled a gun. The two exchanged words before the 29-year-old was shot 4 times. Shockingly, the entire interaction was caught on CCTV footage from a neighboring home. The footage shows that the person who pulled the trigger resembles a woman in a robe, but investigators cannot be sure of the perpetrator's gender at this time, as it's possible they were wearing a disguise. The perpetrator subsequently fled back to their car before speeding away from the scene. The gunshots didn't go unnoticed, and neighbors reported the weapon fire to the police. Paramedics arrived on the scene and rushed Liz to nearby Memorial Hermann Hospital, but she died the following day, just one day before she and Sergio were set to leave for Florida. Despite having footage of the murder, police have been unable to make sense of the case. By all accounts, Liz was an incredibly generous individual. She was a member of the Star Wars charity group, the 501st Legion, and she and her husband would visit sick children in the hospital while dressed in costumes as part of this. She was a huge Star Wars and Harry Potter fan. Family asked mourners to bring wands and lightsabers to her vigil. Police found no evidence of financial difficulties or infidelity between Liz and Sergio, making it difficult for them to determine a motive. Notably, the vehicle that was used by the culprit was seen at around 2 a.m., several hours before the killing, as well as just before Sergio left for work. The car is believed to be a 4-door Nissan Frontier pickup truck. Investigators believe the perpetrator was waiting for Sergio to leave before confronting Liz. During a press conference, Liz's father, Bob Newell, noted the horror he and his family were now facing thanks to the callous actions of another. He said, quote, "A coward drove up, approached my daughter, and forever changed our lives. An unknown assailant shot and killed an unarmed and defenseless woman in a brutal act that demands justice." Sergio told investigators that they did not advertise their garage sale until the morning of when they put up their signs around the neighborhood. Nothing was stolen from the couple's home at the time of the killing. Police revealed that the perpetrator used a revolver, which does not discard shell casings. This year, Fox News reported that a new Harris County Sheriff's detective has been assigned to the case, and that the FBI and Texas Rangers were also investigating. Liz's mother, Rosemary, noted, "We've heard that there's new evidence. We don't know what that is." However, there have been no further updates since. Bob Newell believes that his daughter was murdered in a paid hit, but it is unclear why. Liz's case is still unsolved. Anyone with information about her death can contact Crime Stoppers by calling 713-222-8477. Michaela Bali. 16-year-old Michaela Bali was, by all accounts, an ordinary teen living in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, Canada, when she vanished in 2016. In the days leading up to her disappearance, she reportedly told friends that she would be visiting various locations soon, and she claimed to have $5,000 in her bank account, although the police would later find this to be untrue. On Monday, April 11th, 2016, she asked a friend if she could take her to the local TD bank the following morning. She reportedly communicated with her bank several times that day and wired $25 to her account. Later that night, she messaged several other friends explaining that she was unhappy about something and needed help, but nobody would ever find out what Michaela's issue was. The next morning, at 6:41 a.m. on April 12th, she asked her friend again about the ride to the bank, but the friend told her the bank wouldn't be open yet. As she would any other day, Michaela was driven to school by her grandmother. CCTV showed her dumping a binder inside her locker at 8:21. 9 minutes later, she was seen on camera leaving school through the back entrance. After her disappearance, investigators were able to put together a thorough timeline of events that morning using CCTV, which showed her leaving the school, walking southeast along the railroad tracks, and stopping in at a local pawn shop. The owner claimed she'd tried to pawn a silver ring, but it was too low in value, and he did not make an offer. Between 8:50 and 8:55, she was spotted withdrawing $55 from the bank. At 9 a.m., she was walking east on Broadway Street. Further surveillance showed Michaela at 9:10 a.m., entering a combined Tim Hortons Wendy's restaurant, where she purchased a drink and took a seat at a table. During her time here, CCTV showed her seeming to take apart her phone and put it back together, with some people theorized that she was swapping out SIM cards. 15 minutes later, Michaela left, re-entered immediately, and then left again through another door. Around this time, she was seen on camera walking around the restaurant in a counterclockwise direction. At 9:49 a.m., she returned to the restaurant once more and sat down at a different table. During the next 20 minutes, she frequently used her phone, including making lengthy phone calls. At 10:12, she texted a friend saying, "Hey, I need help." But it was followed up a few minutes later with, "Never mind, I figured it out." During her time at the restaurant, she also spoke with an older woman who revealed to police that Michaela had tried to ask her for help in booking a hotel room, but the woman refused to get involved. The 16-year-old used her phone again after this and left the restaurant for a final time. Sometime after 10:45 a.m., Michaela disappeared from CCTV view, but an employee at a local bus depot remembered her and told authorities that she'd inquired about when the next bus to Regina would leave. When she was told that it wouldn't be until 5 p.m., she left without purchasing a ticket. At 11:35 a.m., she messaged a friend, "I'll see you at lunch." She met with her friends at 11:59 after re-entering the school, where she told them about her plans to visit Regina for a break. She left school again at 12:03 p.m. and subsequently headed to the Trail Stop restaurant next to the bus depot, where she ordered food. Eyewitnesses later informed investigators that she left the restaurant between 1 and 1:45 p.m. Further CCTV footage of Michaela is not available after this point, and her movements are unknown. The police were unable to confirm whether or not she got on any buses from the depot. Michaela did not have a passport with her at the time of her disappearance, and her bank account and social media accounts have been dormant since April 12, 2016. The only exception to this is that a Snapchat message sent to her by a friend was opened in July of that year. Authorities could not determine if anyone actually viewed it. Her phone was turned off at 6:51 on the morning of April 13th. Her disappearance was noticed by her grandmother when she went to pick Michaela up from school, only to find that she hadn't been there all day. She and Michaela's mother initially searched for the 16-year-old by themselves for a few hours before alerting the authorities. The investigation into her disappearance was not very successful. Though investigators were able to create a strong timeline of her morning using CCTV and text messages, as well as social media messages, they lost the trail after she left the Trail Stop restaurant and found very few clues as to what happened to her afterwards. Notably, investigators have stated that it was very difficult to get social media companies to cooperate with them about her private messages sent through them, which caused some hindrance to the case. In August 2017, over a year after she went missing, police searched a wooded area near her high school, but found nothing. One person of interest came to light around this same time, when authorities discovered that she had been seen leaving the restaurant with a man. However, he came forward to speak with investigators, and it seemed he was ruled out of being involved in her disappearance. Furthermore, police located several online friends of Michaela, but this gave them nothing more to work with. Though there has been very little evidence in Michaela's case, speculation has been abundant. Her own mother has expressed fears that her daughter became a victim of human trafficking, while her friends believe she may have left town of her own volition, with one stating, "I know it was her decision, but I'm still kind of kicking myself over it." Her social media posts reportedly made her sound unhappy and indicated that she planned to leave, but her mother noted that those posts were very old and not relevant to her at the time she went missing. Her mother has also noted that Michaela left behind her acne medication and the money she kept at home for emergencies. The most prominent theory in Michaela's case is that she fell victim to an online predator. This is in part because she had an active online social life. On March 21st, 2016, she wrote on her Snapchat and Instagram accounts, "Looking for Snapchat friends because I have no one in real life. Add me." This has led to speculation that she was approached by somebody with sinister intentions who possibly groomed her and lured her into leaving Yorkton. Notably, the 16-year-old was also a user of the Kik messaging app, which has been subject to several controversies. It has been accused of providing anonymity to potential predators. Michaela's real-life friends have stated that they don't know much about her online social life. Her mother, Paula, has stated, "In my heart as a mom, I continue to choose to believe that she's alive. Until someone can prove otherwise, I will believe that." There have been sightings of Michaela up and down the country, but none have been confirmed as the 16-year-old. The RCMP noted that they have followed up on over 1,000 tips received from the public, but still don't have any answers. Michaela Bali has been missing since April 12, 2016. She is described as a white female with blonde hair and blue eyes. She was 5'2" and weighed around 114 pounds at the time of her disappearance. She has a small scar on her right earlobe. Michaela was last seen leaving the Trail Stop restaurant wearing blue jeans, a burgundy jacket, a teal scarf, and embroidered burgundy suede boots. She was also carrying a blue plaid backpack. If she is still alive today, she will be 23 years old. Anyone with information about Michaela's case can contact the RCMP at 1-844-880-6518. Oki Kite. On the morning of May 24, 2004, Aurora police in Colorado were asked to perform a welfare check on Oki Kite, a 53-year-old whose sister, who lived in Virginia, had grown concerned because she'd been unable to reach him, and his employer had told her that he had not shown up for work that morning and could not be contacted. Police knocked on the 53-year-old's door, but found there to be no answer. Concerned for his safety, officers broke into the home. They discovered nothing unusual at first, no signs of forced entry, a robbery, or a struggle, but as they examined the house further, they found Al in the basement in a gruesome and horrifying scene. Examination of Al's body revealed that the 53-year-old's death had been violent. Al bore a wound on the back of his head, suggesting that he'd been hit from behind, possibly while walking down the basement steps. His hands and feet had been bound with cord so that he was hogtied, and he had been tortured for hours, using sharp implements that left him with 22 stab wounds. The torture had been extreme. Al's head was almost severed from his body. Investigators soon learned that shortly before his death, Al had turned the basement into a separate apartment that he could rent out to help him pay the mortgage and utilize a space that he didn't need. However, his tenant had recently moved out, and he had been advertising for a new one. On May 19th, a man identifying himself as Robert contacted Al and claimed that he wanted to move in immediately. He even offered a security deposit and a month's worth of rent up front to speed up the process. Al's girlfriend, Linda, learned about Robert shortly afterwards. Al had told her that Robert had moved from the East Coast, was working at Wells Fargo, and was currently staying with his sister. He was very keen to get out and move into his own space. Linda explained to the police that she had never seen Robert. She had once come close to seeing him when he turned up at the house while she was using the bathroom, but he left before she returned. She claimed, "He did not want me to see him at all." From her conversations with her partner, she gathered that Robert was in his 40s with dark wavy hair, about 5'8", and weighing around 180 pounds. He also dressed well in suits and walked with a limp, using a cane to support himself. Bizarrely, this wasn't the first time landlords in the area had encountered a potential tenant named Robert. A man identifying himself as Robert Cooper and matching the same description as Al's new tenant once approached a local professor to speak with her about a property she was renting out. She noted, though, that he had no limp or cane, and that he spoke with a Romanian accent. 3 more landlords reported having encounters with this man to the police, but they all described him differently, as if he was a chameleon fitting into different backdrops. Police established that Al had met Robert for the first time on May 19th. He was seen by several neighbors leaving the property. Over the next few days, neighbors had weird interactions with him where he seemed to ignore or stare through people in an unsettling manner. Linda reported that she last spoke to Al on May 22nd. He had dropped her off at the airport for a trip, and she had called him around 3:30 p.m. just after she landed. Returning to the crime scene, investigators established that after murdering and torturing Al, the culprit had hung around the home, eating food from the fridge, sleeping in Al's bed, and even wearing some of his clothes. The perp then scrubbed the home thoroughly using bleach to destroy any forensic evidence, though trace amounts of DNA were recovered. The knives he'd used had been left soaking in bleach, along with other items he had touched, including a house key that Al had provided him with. Authorities also discovered that Al's phone was missing, and his vehicle had been stolen from the driveway, and they suspected that the perpetrator had taken the items before leaving the scene. The car would be later found just over a block and a half away from Al's. Although it was clear the culprit had cleaned up expertly, one important item investigators recovered from the scene was a rental application by Robert Cooper. It listed the address of his supposed sister as a building on the University of Colorado Medical School campus, and the social security number belonged to an elderly woman completely unrelated to the case. Finally, the phone number he supplied belonged to a burner. Though the phone, along with Al's, was traced, both were discovered abandoned in Denver near an area populated by unhoused people. Investigators theorized that they had been left there in the hopes that the unhoused who lived there would take the phones and use them. The burner phone was found to have been purchased near the University of Colorado Medical School. This led to speculation that the perpetrator had a connection with the campus. This police theory was further fueled when they discovered that some of the rental applications Robert Cooper had made were for properties, which were advertised exclusively in the university library. Following the murder, Robert Cooper withdrew money from Al's bank account at an ATM. His image was captured on ATM CCTV, but a ski mask covered his face, making him impossible to identify. Furthermore, he wore gloves, so investigators couldn't gather fingerprints. Even though Al was a wealthy man, Cooper reportedly only took $1,000 from his bank account. This led police to rule out the theory that the killer was motivated by robbery. Chillingly, the main theory is now that Al was the victim of a sadistic killer driven by nothing but a thirst for blood. Al's case is still unsolved. If you have any information about the case, you can contact the FBI at tips.fbi.gov/home. Alvin and Judith Neely. 26-year-old Alvin Neely met with 15-year-old Judith Ann Adams in 1980, and shortly after, he left his wife and 3 children to elope with her. Judith was described in her youth as a troubled child from a big family in Tennessee. She lost her alcoholic father when she was 9, following a motorcycle accident, and when she met Alvin in her teens, she embarked on a life of crime with him. What began as petty thefts became armed robbery, which then escalated to murder. The pair's first victim was a 13-year-old named Lisa Ann Milliken, who vanished on September 25, 1982. A resident of a children's home, Lisa had been visiting the arcade at Riverbend Mall in Rome, Georgia, with other residents when she was lured away from the group by the Neelys and taken to a motel in Scottsboro, Alabama. The next few days were the most horrific of Lisa's short life. She was raped multiple times by both Neelys for 3 days, until she was taken to Little River Canyon in Fort Payne, Alabama by Judith and handcuffed to a tree. Judith then injected Lisa 6 different times with bleach and drain cleaner. The injection sites were both sides of her neck, both arms, and both buttocks. Lisa suffered excruciating pain, but did not die until Judith turned a gun on her and pulled the trigger, before pushing the 13-year-old's body into the canyon. The couple later called the authorities several times to report the body, which was found on the canyon floor. The lives of the Neelys were far from glamorous. After the murder, they drove across the American South, sleeping in their car, constantly on the run. They stole to fund their lives and forged checks, and at the age of 16, Judith became pregnant with twins. Even far into her pregnancy, Judith continued to commit crimes, including armed robberies. A failed robbery in Georgia saw the two put in prison, where Judith gave birth. But as soon as they were out, the couple reunited and continued with their life of crime. On October 4th, 1982, the Neelys came across a young couple named Janice Chapman and John Hancock. They lured the pair in with promises of an exciting party, but in reality, Judith took them to the woods, where Alvin shot John and left him to die. Now left with Janice, they bundled her into their vehicle and drove to their motel, where she was tortured before she was killed. The Neelys were unable to take any more victims after this because they botched the previous crime. Neither Judith nor Alvin had bothered to check if John Hancock was actually dead after he was shot. The young man survived his wounds, and not only was he able to get help, but he was able to assist in the identification of the assailants. The lead detective on the case subsequently followed the Neelys for several weeks before arresting them in Tennessee. In order to avoid the death penalty, Alvin pleaded guilty to murder and aggravated assault in Georgia, but was not tried for the murder of Lisa Milliken, since it was Judith who pulled the trigger. He was sentenced to life in prison. Judith, meanwhile, did not plead guilty and was put on trial in March of 1983. While awaiting the start of the trial, she gave birth to the couple's third child. 6 weeks after the trial began, Judith was convicted of the torture murder of Lisa Milliken and sentenced to death via the electric chair, a decision which had come from the judge as the jury had recommended life imprisonment. She was the youngest woman sentenced to death in the US at just 18 years old. Following the conviction, she decided to plead guilty to the murder of Janice Chapman. She attempted to appeal for a new trial in regards to the Lisa Milliken case, but her request was denied. In 1999, when she was just days from her execution date, her sentence was commuted to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 31 years behind bars. The governor who made this decision, Fob James, reportedly cited the fact that the jury had recommended life in prison at her trial as the reasoning behind his verdict. In 2023, Judith was denied parole. The sister of Lisa, Tina Milliken, recalled being frustrated that it was even a possibility that Judith be released to the public, stating, quote, "She killed a child. Why keep going through this? Why keep putting families through this?" Numerous Milliken family members spoke at the hearing, as did the former DA, Mike Odell, who described Judith as someone who killed for sport and added that she was evil and depraved. Judith will be up for parole again in 2028. Alvin died in prison in 2005. Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown. Deborah Brown was 21 when she met 28-year-old Alton Coleman in 1983. It's unclear where the two met, but by all accounts, Brown quickly fell under Coleman's spell, breaking off her engagement to be with him. Described as a non-violent, borderline intellectually disabled woman, Brown was the complete opposite of Coleman, a middle school dropout who lived with his grandmother and had been in and out of trouble with the law since the early 1970s. He had been charged with sex crimes 6 times over the last decade, with 2 of those cases being dismissed. He was acquitted on 2 of the other charges and pled guilty to a lesser crime. He was due to go on trial in Illinois following the rape of a 14-year-old, but fled the state and began a killing spree with his new girlfriend, Brown, instead. The couple's first murder occurred on May 29, 1984, after they befriended Juanita Wheat in order to get to her 9-year-old daughter, Vanita. The little girl was taken from Kenosha, Wisconsin, to the city of Waukegan, Illinois, 20 miles away, where she was raped and strangled to death. Her body was found on June 19th in an abandoned building, just 4 blocks from where Coleman had been living with his grandmother. 2 days after the death of Vanita Wheat, they befriended a man named Robert Carpenter, spent the night at his house, and asked to borrow his car to run some errands the next morning. Of course, the couple never returned, and the man was left without his vehicle. Brown and Coleman took off for Indiana, where they wound up in the city of Gary. By this time, the FBI were aware that Coleman was on the run and were beginning their pursuit of the couple, unaware that the body of Vanita Wheat was lying abandoned in Waukegan. In Gary, on June 18th, the couple spotted 2 little girls walking near their home and snatched them from the streets. They were subsequently beaten and raped, with 9-year-old Annie Turks managing to survive as she was left abandoned after being choked into unconsciousness, while her niece, 7-year-old Tamika Turks, was strangled to death. Tamika's body was recovered the following day, partially decomposed. Later that day, 25-year-old Donna Williams vanished from Gary. Like the other victims, she was raped and strangled. Her body was discovered several weeks later on July 11th in Detroit, Michigan, just half a mile from where her vehicle was located at the time of her disappearance. On July 2nd, Coleman beat a Detroit couple in their home with a pipe. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer Jones of Dearborn Heights were severely injured, with Coleman ripping their telephone from their wall so they couldn't call for help. The couple then stole their money and fled the scene in their car. The pair then moved to Toledo, Ohio, where, 5 days later, they murdered Virginia Temple, a woman they had befriended. According to reports, Virginia, a mother of several children, had not been heard from in days when police went to check on her. Inside, they found most of the children scared but unharmed. However, upon examining the home's crawl space, authorities discovered the bodies of Virginia and her eldest daughter, 9-year-old Rachel. They had both been strangled to death and stuffed inside. That same day, Brown and Coleman entered the home of another couple, this time Frank and Dorothy Duvendak, who resided in Toledo. The Duvendaks were bound with electrical cords so that Brown and Coleman could steal their money, valuables, and vehicle. Following the murders of Virginia and Rachel Temple, the couple fled to Dayton, where they visited Reverend Millard Gay and his wife, Catherine. Coleman and Brown stayed with the Gays for a short while and accompanied them to a church service on July 9th. They were then dropped off in Cincinnati, where 3 days later, the couple picked out their next victim. 15-year-old Toni Story went missing on July 12th from her neighborhood of Over the Rhine. 8 days later, her remains were found, reportedly with a piece of jewelry that had been stolen from the Temple residence. On July 19th, the killers cycled to Norwood, where they attacked another couple, Harry and Marlene Walters. Harry had been beaten into unconsciousness, while Marlene was raped and beaten to death. A later report by the coroner noted that Marlene's assault was vicious. She was hit around 20 to 25 times with a blunt object. The pair stole the Walters car after the assault and murder and fled the scene. Brown and Coleman subsequently went to Kentucky, where they kidnapped a university professor and stuffed him into the trunk of his car after demanding his wallet. The professor would later tell police after he was found in the boot of the abandoned vehicle that the pair had made him call his wife and tell her he had a massive gambling debt and owed a lot of money. All the cash in their savings account was to be brought to a phone booth in Richmond, but the couple didn't bother to collect the money, and it's unknown why. Brown and Coleman left the car on July 17th in Dayton and returned to the home of the Gays to steal their car. Their last victim was 75-year-old Eugene Scott, who was murdered in Indianapolis. The pair stole his vehicle before heading to Evanston, Illinois. Coleman and Brown were now wanted criminals, even making it to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, although they were technically 11th on the list. Since their faces and descriptions were plastered everywhere, it was easy enough for witnesses to identify them, and they did. The couple were arrested on July 20th in Evanston. Ultimately, they were found guilty of the rape and murder of Toni Story, as well as Marlene Walters in the state of Ohio, and sentenced to death. Coleman reportedly responded to this with, "I'm dead already." The couple were also given 20 years each concerning the kidnapping of the professor, whom they drove across state lines. Coleman was executed by lethal injection on April 26, 2002. For some time, Brown was the last woman on Indiana's death row, but a Lake County prosecutor and the Indiana Attorney General's office withdrew the execution demand in 2018 after her lawyers appealed, citing mental health issues. Similarly, her death sentence in Ohio was commuted to life in prison in 1991 due to her low IQ scores, her lack of criminal record prior to meeting Coleman, and what is described as a master-slave dynamic she had with him, which was said to have influenced her actions. Brown will likely never see the light of day, however, as she is serving 140 years in prison in Indiana, as well as her Ohio life sentence. She is currently incarcerated at the Dayton Correctional Institution in Dayton, Ohio. Monique Olivier and Michel Fourniret. Michel Paul Fourniret, born April 4, 1942, in Sedan, France, had a criminal record long before he began committing murders with his wife. As an adult, he drifted through life, bouncing from one minimum wage job to another, seemingly aimless, and by the mid-1960s, he was running into trouble with the law. He was first arrested in 1966 after sexually assaulting a young girl, and by 1984 he was in prison, serving time after sexually abusing 5 more young women. While incarcerated, he he began writing letters to a woman named Monique Olivier as part of a pen pal program. He described horrific and violent fantasies of abusing and murdering children in his letters, and Olivier responded by claiming that she'd help him fulfill these fantasies if he murdered her husband. Although he never did, the pair began a relationship anyway once Fourniret was released from prison in 1987. In early December that year, the couple found their first target, a 17-year-old schoolgirl named Isabelle Laville. On the 11th, the pair drove in separate vehicles to where they found Isabelle walking home. Olivier stopped her car and asked Isabelle if she would hop in and give her directions, to which the 17-year-old agreed. They continued driving a little until they came across Michel, who was standing by the side of the road pretending his car had broken down. Olivier offered him a lift and he climbed in the back. There, he choked Isabelle with a piece of rope while his partner sedated her using the date rape drug Rohypnol. The couple subsequently drove Isabelle to their home, where she was raped and strangled to death. Her body was thrown down a disused well, where it remained until July 11, 2006, when it was finally retrieved, 18 years after she vanished. In March of the following year, Farida Hamik, the wife of an incarcerated bank robber, contacted Michel. She knew him because her husband had shared a cell with him in prison, and she asked for his help in retrieving some stolen goods from a cemetery. Michel agreed. After gathering the items, Farida gave him a share of the goods. On April 12th, though, Michel and Monique decided they wanted the whole haul. They lured Farida out of her home and strangled and buried her body before going back to her house to retrieve the items. They used the money they subsequently made to purchase a chateau in Donchery in northern France. Farida's body has never been recovered. 5 months later, in August 1988, the couple struck again, when Monique, who is now pregnant with Michel's baby, asked a 20-year-old woman to get in the car with them so they could be directed to the nearest doctors. Monique pretended to be ill, and the woman, Fabienne Leroy, agreed. However, Michel drove to a nearby forest instead, where Fabienne was raped and murdered via gunshot. In March of 1989, 21-year-old Jean-Marie Desremaux became the next victim after she met Michel on the train several times starting in January, and he and Monique invited her to their home for a meal. At their home, however, things took a turn when Michel asked Jean-Marie if she was a virgin, and she explained that she wasn't and had a boyfriend. By all accounts, this greatly angered Michel, and he began to attack her and attempted to rape her. Jean-Marie fought back and almost escaped, but the couple caught her, gagged her using bandages, and strangled her to death. They buried her body in the garden of their chateau. In December of 1989, 6 months after they tied the knot, and now with a 1-year-old child in the back seat, the couple looked for their next victim, eventually settling on a 12-year-old girl named Elisabeth Brichette, who was walking home from a friend's house in the city of Namur, Belgium. Elizabeth was ultimately strangled to death after Michel failed to suffocate her using a plastic bag, and her body was buried in the chateau garden near Jean-Marie's. The remains of both girls would be found in 2004 after the couple confessed to the murders. The final murder at the hands of the couple occurred on November 21st, 1990, when they came across 13-year-old Natasha Dainas, who was walking home. As they always did, the couple lured her into their car and drove her to a secluded area where she was stabbed twice in the chest with a screwdriver and strangled. Her body was left on the nearby beach, and a later examination of the body by the coroner revealed that Natasha had been raped post-mortem. Between 2000 and 2001, Michel committed 2 more murders without his wife. The first was of 18-year-old Celine Saison, who was raped and strangled with rope, and the second was a 13-year-old girl named Mananya Tumpong, who he invited to play with his son. Instead of taking her home to see the boy, though, Michel drove her to a secluded area where she was strangled to death. He also attempted to kidnap a 13-year-old girl in 2003, but failed. Notably, he was investigated around this time as the possible perpetrator, but authorities could not link him to the crime. It wasn't until a year later that Monique revealed to the police that her husband had been murdering since 1987. When investigators questioned Michel, he revealed that he'd killed 8 women and girls, and 1 man whose name remains unknown. Michel was subsequently extradited to France along with his wife, as the couple were living in Belgium at the time, and he was convicted of 7 murders. Following his conviction, he was given life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Monique was given life in prison, though she would be eligible for parole after serving 28 years. In recent years, Michel has confessed to 3 more murders, all of them women and girls between the ages of 9 and 20. Michel Fourniret died in 2021, aged 79. He has been dubbed Ogre of the Ardennes. Meanwhile, in 2023, Monique Olivier was tried for her part in the final 3 murders her husband confessed to and was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. When asked about Olivier, the father of one of the victims noted, "Her presence alone would have gained the confidence of all the victims, who would never have believed a woman could have been such a part of such an appalling and depraved act." At her sentencing, Olivier said, "I regret everything I did, and I ask for forgiveness from the families of the victims, while knowing that it is unforgivable." However, the president of the court stated that Olivier, quote, "had no empathy for her victims, who she dehumanized." Allan Ruby. On October 12, 2014, 19-year-old Allan Ruby posted this image to his Instagram account with the caption, "College wouldn't be half as great without these 2 peaches." This seemingly ordinary photo, though, becomes much more sinister when you discover that just 3 days earlier, Ruby had taken the lives of his entire family and was pretending not to know of the violence that had unfolded in his parents' home. Ruby's father, John, and mother, Joy, residents of Duncan, Oklahoma, were both employees at the local newspaper named the Marlow Review. Before this, John had been the former publisher for the Duncan Banner, with the family selling the business in 1997. Together they had 2 children, 17-year-old Catherine, a junior at Duncan High School, and 19-year-old Allan, a student at the University of Oklahoma. The family were, by all accounts, wealthy. Ruby was used to spending lavishly, treating his friends to hotel stays, flying off on jaunts around Europe, and gifting himself designer shoes. A shiny Rolex sat on his wrist at all times, and he would always travel first class, looking down on his fellow students who could barely afford anything more than a pack of instant noodles for dinner. In a blog post from March 2014, he wrote, "There is no bigger rush than getting to the register at a store and swiping your credit card. And in that moment, you are waiting for the screen to say approved, you start to get heart palpitations and you get a rush of adrenaline. By the time she's handing your stuff to you, you are so high on adrenaline, the $15,000 total does not even faze you until you've gotten home and seen the receipts." But Ruby's taste for the good life had gotten wildly out of hand in the months leading up to the murders. In January 2014, he pled guilty to a charge of credit card theft after stealing his grandmother's card. He owed $491 in fines and court costs and was scheduled to appear again in court on November 12th for his final sentencing. His parents had paid for him to go on a trip to Europe, but he had used his grandmother's credit card to pay for the experiences he had while there, racking up $5,000 in charges. 2 years before that, he had reportedly assaulted his own mother after they fought about his spending habits. She opted not to press charges. By the time of the murders, he owed $3,000 to a loan company and was being investigated for having stolen and forged $17,500 worth of checks. The theft of his grandmother's credit card, though, was the final straw for Joy and John, who cut Ruby off financially. The family's housekeeper, Rosie, later testified that Joy had tearfully told her about the things she'd heard from a friend. Reportedly, Ruby was going around telling his friends he was going to kill us. On the morning of October 13th, 2014, Rosie called the police. She was distressed and shocked and explained that she had turned up to work to find 3 Ruby family members dead. One neighbor recalled being baffled by the triple murder, stating, "They were a good family. They would always help you out. If your car wouldn't start, they'd come over and jump it, or if your dog ran off, they'd try to help you catch it. Just neighborly things." Rosie told investigators that she was not sure whether or not to report to work on the morning of the 13th, as she hadn't heard from Joy. She decided to err on the side of caution and showed up at the family home anyway, where, before long, she discovered the bodies. Joy was on the kitchen floor, John face down in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room. The family had been dead for 4 days. Hours after the bodies of his family were discovered, Ruby was arrested in connection with the credit card theft case. When informed that his parents and sister were dead, he began, quote, wailing and crying and having a hard time. Eventually, investigators said he settled down enough for them to interview him. They noted that at this point, Ruby had become their number one suspect in the murders, and it wasn't long before he confessed. Ruby told detectives that on October 9th, he had taken his father's gun and approached his mother first in the kitchen. When Joy turned to him, he shot her in the head. However, after collapsing on the floor, she still showed signs of life, so Ruby shot his mother once again. His 17-year-old sister, Catherine, was outside, but came in, possibly after hearing the commotion. As she stepped into the kitchen, he shot her once. Ruby believed she died instantly. His father, John, was the last one to die because he had been at work all day. When he returned home, about an hour after Catherine and Joy were shot, he entered the kitchen, only to be met by his son. Ruby fired the gun, shooting his father in the head. Like his mother, though, his father was still alive when he hit the ground, so Ruby fired again. Following the murders, Ruby ransacked the house to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He took the footage from his family's at-home surveillance system and fled to his university campus. He disposed of the gun and surveillance footage in a lake en route. He later traveled to Dallas, where his university was playing a sports match against the University of Texas, though he didn't attend the game. He then stayed with friends at the Ritz-Carlton in Dallas. Ruby also admitted to police that he left his phone behind when he traveled to Duncan, so that his real location wouldn't be given away if investigators looked into it. He reportedly posted photos of the view from his dorm room on the night of the murders. He believed that if his family were dead, he could access his inheritance, pay off his debts, and continue spending lavishly. In 2016, Ruby pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder as part of a plea bargain where he would avoid the death penalty, which the prosecution had originally been seeking. He was given 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, and agreed, as part of the deal, not to contact his relatives, not to profit from his crimes through book or movie deals, and not to communicate with the media. John Edward Robinson. This family portrait of 5 smiling individuals and a baby seems completely innocuous on the surface, until you realize that the man in the yellow jumper is one of America's most disturbing serial killers, and that the baby on his lap is the child of one of his victims. John Edward Robinson was born on December 27, 1943, in Cicero, Illinois. A poor student hailing from a strict and abusive household, he spent his youth getting into fights and dropping out of school and university. In 1969, he was arrested in Kansas City for embezzling $33,000 from a medical practice where he worked as a radiographer using forged credentials. Though Robinson had attended university and studied to become a radiographer, he dropped out after 2 years. He was given 3 years of probation for this crime, but immediately violated his probation by moving to Chicago without permission. In 1971, he was arrested for embezzling funds while working as an insurance salesman. He returned to Kansas City, and his probation was extended. Over the next decade, Robinson would continue to commit non-violent, often financial, crimes. Though Robinson is known to be responsible for 8 murders, he may have committed more. Investigators have observed that there are periods in his life that remain unaccounted for, and several of his confirmed victims were either never reported missing or have never been found, suggesting that there may be many, many more unknown victims out there. His first known victim was 19-year-old Paula Godfrey, whom Robinson hired at his management consulting firm in 1984. He told her he was sending her and several other female employees, who did not exist, on a trip to San Antonio, Texas, to take a clerical skills course, and picked her up from her home on September 1st to take her to the airport. However, Paula never came back. She lived with her parents at the time of her disappearance, and they reported her missing when she didn't return. Robinson claimed he knew nothing of her whereabouts, but days later, a typewritten letter appeared on the parents' doorstep, supposedly signed by Paula. She reassured her parents that she was fine, and she didn't want to see or speak with them. She has never been seen or heard from again, with law enforcement claiming at the time that, because she was legally an adult, there was nothing they could do if she had left of her own volition, as the letter stated. Robinson's most notable crime, however, came a year later, when he met 19-year-old Lisa Stacy. Lisa was the mother of a 4-month-old baby, Tiffany, and was living at a women's shelter in Kansas City. Robinson, using the alias John Osborne, invited Lisa to join the Kansas City Outreach Program, a program he had supposedly started to help downtrodden women. He visited shelters and hospitals to try and entice women to join, and claimed that they would be given free room and board while studying, and that he would be able to help them get jobs after they received their qualifications. Lisa was taken with the idea, hoping to give her baby a better life, and Robinson subsequently put her and Tiffany up in a hotel. In exchange for his hospitality, however, Robinson asked her to sign 4 sheets of paper. Soon, Lisa called her family, crying hysterically and explaining that she'd signed paperwork. Her mother-in-law, Betty, told her not to sign anything, quote, and she was just crying, and then she finally settled down, and she says, "Here they come now." And she hung up, and that was the last time I heard from her. Nobody saw or heard from Lisa again. Her family received a typewritten letter days later, similar to the one Paula Godfrey's family received. It was supposedly signed by Lisa. The director of the women's shelter where Lisa stayed also got a letter, which read in part, "I want to thank you for all your help. I've decided to get away from this area and try to make a good life for me and Tiffany." Lisa's mother noted that her daughter was not skilled enough at typewriting to have written such lengthy letters. Between 1987 and 1993, Robinson was in prison for multiple fraud convictions and parole violations, and between 1994 and 2000, 6 more women disappeared. However, he became increasingly careless, and by 1999, he had attracted the attention of investigators, given how often he was linked to missing persons cases. He was arrested in June 2000 after a sexual battery complaint was filed against him, while another woman accused him of theft. Investigators began searching Robinson's property, which is where they found the bodies of 2 of his victims in 85-pound chemical drums. 3 further bodies were found on the property. In 2003, he was found guilty of 3 murders, and in 2005, he accepted responsibility for 5 more so that he could avoid the death penalty. He is currently 80 years old and still in prison. As for the baby seen in that eerie photograph, she is Tiffany Stacy. Days after Lisa's disappearance, Robinson approached his brother, Donald, and sister-in-law, who were looking to adopt a baby but had so far been unsuccessful while using traditional channels. He claimed that he knew of a baby whose mother had recently taken her own life and asked for $5,000 in legal fees. Donald and his wife happily agreed to pay, and baby Tiffany was handed over and given the name Heather. It wasn't until 2000, following Robinson's arrest, that she discovered her true identity after DNA testing proved she was Tiffany Stacy. She was 15 at the time. Heather ultimately chose to keep the name Donald and his wife gave her, and was officially adopted by the couple when she was 18. Though Robinson was charged with Lisa's murder, her body has never been found, and the exact events that occurred on the day of her disappearance are still unknown. Franklin Floyd. Much like the previous image, this photograph looks harmless enough at first glance. Surely, this is a simple photograph of a father and daughter. Unfortunately, this photo is of convicted murderer and rapist Franklin Floyd and one of his victims, Suzanne Savakis, the daughter of his first wife, whom he abducted as a child and eventually married. Floyd was born in Barnesville, Georgia on July 17, 1943. His father died just 1 year later, leaving his mother to try and raise 5 children alone. She struggled to make ends meet, and eventually the children were put into care. Floyd claimed to have been physically and sexually abused by other children and staff at the children's home where he lived, and as a teenager, he turned to a life of crime. His first documented violent crime occurred in 1962, when he was 18. He abducted a 4-year-old child from a bowling alley and sexually assaulted her in the nearby woods. He was given 10 to 20 years for kidnapping and child molestation before being released and sent to a halfway house in 1972. 3 months later, he attempted to sexually assault a woman at a petrol station, but she managed to escape. He was arrested but made bail and subsequently fled the area, making him a fugitive. In 1974, Floyd met Sandra Brandenburg, who was the mother of 4 children: 5-year-old Suzanne Savakis, 3-year-old Allison Brandenburg, 2-year-old Amy Brandenburg, and newborn baby Philip Brandenburg. Floyd and Sandra dated for a month before tying the knot, and she moved into his home with her children in Dallas, Texas. She later told the makers of the Netflix documentary, Girl in the Picture, that she had been at risk of losing her children when Floyd approached her in church and offered to marry her and adopt the children, hence the whirlwind union. In 1975, Sandra was given 30 days in prison for passing bad checks. The children were left with Floyd while she served her sentence, but when she returned home, she found that they were all gone. She managed to find Allison and Amy in a church-operated social services group, but was unable to locate Suzanne or Philip. She tried to file kidnapping charges, but was told by law enforcement that, as the children's stepfather, Floyd had a right to take the children. Floyd raised Suzanne as his daughter. He often gave inconsistent and conflicting statements about how he had taken custody of her and enrolled her in various schools under different names. She first appeared in an Oklahoma City school in 1975, where she went by the name of Suzanne Davis. By the time she graduated high school in Georgia, 1986, she was using the name Sharon Marshall. She dreamt of going to university to study aerospace engineering and had earned a full scholarship to do so at the Georgia Institute of Technology, but told a friend that she was pregnant and her father wouldn't allow her to attend further education. She later gave birth to her baby, who was put up for adoption. Afterwards, she moved to Florida with Floyd and began working as an exotic dancer. She soon became pregnant again, and Michael Hughes was born in 1988. Suzanne married Floyd a year later, aged 19, in New Orleans, with the pair using the aliases Clarence Hughes and Tonya Tadlock. During their time in New Orleans, Suzanne gave birth to another child named Megan, who was also given up for adoption. In April of 1989, friends Suzanne made at work encouraged her to leave her husband, whom they saw as domineering and abusive. However, Suzanne told them that he would kill her and her son if she did, noting that Floyd had joined the Fraternal Order of Police, despite not being a police officer, and that he could track her anywhere she went using his connections. By 1990, though, Suzanne realized that she was tired of the life she'd been living and wanted to run away with her son and Kevin Brown, a man she was having a secret relationship with. Tragically, Suzanne was not able to find her happily ever after. She was found dead later that same month, aged just 20, at the side of the highway outside Oklahoma City. Food items were scattered around her, leading to the belief that she'd been out for a shop and was attacked when heading back to the motel room she was sharing with Floyd. Authorities theorized that she'd been struck by a car, and though she was alive when she was found, she died in hospital. Floyd claimed that he'd fallen asleep after his wife had stepped out to get groceries. Suzanne's real identity was not established until 2014. After her death, Suzanne's son Michael was placed into foster care, and Floyd left the state. Michael's foster parents reported that he had limited muscle control and was non-verbal, but that he was doing well under their care. In 1994, they started the adoption process. Meanwhile, Floyd was imprisoned for a brief time, and when he was released, he tried to get custody of Michael. However, given his criminal record and the fact his DNA showed he wasn't the boy's biological father, he was refused. On September 12, 1994, Floyd took matters into his own hands when he entered Michael's school, pointed a gun at the principal and managed to abduct Michael and secure him in his pickup truck. He was arrested 2 months later in Kentucky, but Michael was nowhere to be seen, and it wasn't until 2015 that Floyd admitted he shot the little boy twice in the back of the head after abducting him. His body has never been found. In 2001, Floyd was convicted of kidnapping Michael and was sentenced to 52 years without parole. Shortly afterwards, he was suspected of being involved with the murder of 18-year-old Cheryl Ann Comesso, a work colleague of Suzanne's. Months after his conviction, investigators recovered dozens of photographs of beaten and bound women, some of which were images of Cheryl. Worse still, law enforcement also found sexually explicit images of young girls, including Suzanne. These photos had been placed in an envelope and taped to the underside of a truck belonging to Floyd. Floyd had been seen getting into a fight with Cheryl after he accused her of reporting Suzanne for misstating her income so that she lost her government benefits. A witness recalled seeing him punch Cheryl in the face. She vanished in 1989, and Suzanne and Floyd left Oklahoma shortly afterwards, but not before setting fire to their trailer so that it burned to the ground. Cheryl's body was found in 1995, off Interstate 275 in Pinellas County, Florida. Floyd was sentenced to death for the murder, but died in prison in January 2023 of natural causes, aged 79. Suzanne's missing brother, Philip, was discovered alive and well in 2019, with DNA tests confirming his identity a year later. He had been adopted by a couple who raised him as their own when he was 6 weeks old. Notably, Suzanne's third child, who she gave up for adoption in 1989 in New Orleans, has also been tracked down. Megan Dufresne was raised by Mary and Dean Dufresne and lived a normal, happy, and healthy life after she was adopted. She now has 2 children of her own. One of them is named Michael, after her brother. Vasile Gorgos. 63-year-old Vasile Gorgos was living in eastern Romania at the time of his disappearance. A cattle farmer and trader, Vasile was known to go on regular trips for his business, and on this particular day in 1991, he had already purchased his train ticket. Though he was away from home frequently, Vasile would always keep in touch with his family and arrived home when he said he would. But this time it was different. After leaving for a trip, he never returned, and although the police were contacted, virtually no leads or clues were found in the case. Vasile's family grew more and more concerned as time passed, with the days bleeding into weeks, months, and eventually years. They came to terms with the fact that they would likely never see him again, and accepted that if he had died, there was a chance it was not peaceful or accidental. The family held regular memorial services and grieved for him over the years. But in a shocking turn of events, they did see Vasile again. On August 29th, 2021, 30 years after he went missing, a car pulled up in front of his home, and out stepped 93-year-old Vasile, wearing the same clothes that he had disappeared in. He had nothing new, no new possessions or any luggage, and inside his pocket, his family found his train ticket, which he was due to travel with on the day of his disappearance, and his ID. He was in good condition, showing no signs of neglect or abuse. Notably, Vasile had not been in the driver's seat of the car, and the vehicle sped off before anyone could ask questions or see the driver. Unfortunately, relatives were unable to remember the license plate number. When asked where he'd been for the last 3 decades, the 93-year-old replied, "Home." While he was examined by a doctor following his return to his family, he was described as being in very good health aside from some neurological issues, which were said to be nothing out of the ordinary for his age. His memories from before his disappearance were reportedly mostly very clear. His wife had died, he was born in 1928, and his parents were well-established and respected merchants. However, he struggled to recognize his 2 children, possibly due to how much time had passed. Despite being questioned about his whereabouts, Vasile could never recall what had happened to him in August 1991, when he'd left home for a routine business trip. Without proper answers, armchair detectives had been promising all sorts of theories on social media. Some speculated that he abandoned his old life to start anew, possibly with a lover, and that he returned home to make amends before his health deteriorated. Others have suggested that he spent 30 years in prison, but hadn't wanted to reveal this information to his family. This idea came about because Vasile was wearing the same clothing he had on the day he went missing. Another theory suggests that he had been kidnapped and forced to work in manual labor for the last 3 decades. Vasile's son initially didn't recognize his father. He told local media, "We don't understand him. He doesn't know what he's saying. He talks to us about the period when he was involved in raising and selling cows. We ask him one thing and he tells us another. Who knows where he has been? Who kept him? Maybe he was forced to work. Who knows what kind of life he led?" To this day, Vasile's whereabouts between 1991 and 2021 remain a mystery. Gabriel Naggi. Gabriel Naggi was last seen on January 21st, 1987 in Sydney, Australia. An accounting student taking night classes while working during the day, Gabriel was also a father of 2 young children, 9-year-old Jennifer and 11-year-old Stephen. On the day of his disappearance, he called his wife, Pam, to let her know he'd be home for lunch. Though Pam prepared him a meal, Gabriel never returned home. The following day, investigators reached out to the family after Gabriel's car was found on the side of the road. It had been burned out and abandoned, and Pam filed a missing persons report for her husband, terrified about his safety. Gabriel was a reliable man. He did what he said he would do, and was always on time. If he was ever held up for anything, he would always call. The fact that he had neglected to come home the day before, and that his car had been abandoned, made Pam fear the worst. Over the next few weeks, searches were made for Gabriel, and missing posters were distributed. When the police checked out the couple's finances, they discovered that the 46-year-old had withdrawn cash from an ATM in Newcastle, about 93 miles from Sydney. This was the only clue they found in the case. Pam could not account for why Gabriel was in Newcastle, and investigators were unable to uncover further leads. Gabriel Naggi was a missing person for 20 years. During that time, his children grew to adults and started families of their own, and while the family eventually moved house in the years following the disappearance, Pam always made sure they were registered in the phone book in case Gabriel ever wanted to reach out. But when 2 years became 5, 10, 20, they realized that things could be worse than they initially thought. Incredibly, just 2 weeks before Gabriel was due to be declared dead, the lead detective on his case decided to give it just one more look, and when she did, she discovered a Medicare record in Gabriel's name. Authorities soon turned up on Gabriel's doorstep. At the time, he sometimes called himself Ron Sanders. He was living in Mackay, nearly 1,000 miles away from where his car had been found abandoned. Gabriel did not recall anything about his past. He had been making his living doing odd jobs on fishing boats and construction sites, and explained that he had been living as Ron Sanders for a long time, but had recently remembered his real name. He also recalled that he had been in Newcastle, where his car had been found, and had a bleeding head wound. He showed off a scar on the back of his head, which led him to believe he may have been suffering from memory loss. The last 20 years of his life had not always been easy. He had sometimes slept on the street or beach, and he used alcohol as a crutch at times. A local pastor had recently offered him work and a room, and it was he who helped Gabriel get a Medicare card when he needed surgery. Gabriel would later tell the Chronicle Mail that the detective asked me a lot of questions and started showing me photographs. It was like a cartoon, where flashbulbs go off on the top of people's heads. She gave me a letter from Jennifer, a letter from Pam, and letters from my dad and stepmom. Later that day, Gabriel sat down and wrote responses to the letters. In the days following, his daughter sent him a text message. He recalled, it said, "Hi, Dad," and that was enough to make me cry. She wrote that she'd finished the letter and she still loved me. 10 minutes later, the phone rang and it was Pam. We talked until the battery died. It is generally believed that Gabriel developed the memory loss disorder named dissociative fugue after his car accident. Though they do not live together, Gabriel keeps in constant contact with his wife, children, and parents. Mary Day. Born in Little Falls, New York in 1968, Mary Louise Day was the oldest of 3 children born to Charles and Charlotte Day. By all accounts, Mary's childhood was a difficult one. Her mother was often unable to care for the children, resulting in the 3 sisters spending their youth in and out of foster homes. Eventually, their parents divorced, and Charlotte married an army soldier named William Hole. The couple had 2 children together, and Charlotte organized to take full custody of Mary and her sibling, Kathy. Their youngest sister, Sherry, remained in foster care and was ultimately adopted by her foster family. In 1978, shortly after the family relocated to Hawaii as part of William's job, Mary and Kathy's biological father, Charles, died in an accident, leaving the girls an inheritance, which they referred to by the code name Mohawk. In 1980, at the age of 12, Mary was removed from Charlotte and William's custody when it was discovered that the latter had been physically abusing her. While the family moved to Seaside, California afterwards due to William's job, Mary remained in Hawaii. She was eventually sent to live with her mother and stepfather again, however. Mary was last seen on July 15, 1981, but she was never reported missing by her mother and stepfather. According to CBS, on the night that she was last seen alive, William physically attacked Mary after he accused her of poisoning his dog, which was sick. William and Charlotte would later claim that the 13-year-old was gone the following morning. Though her sister, Kathy, asked where she was, Charlotte told her simply that Mary had run away and to never ask about her again. In 1994, over a decade after Mary went missing, her youngest sister, Sherry, filed a missing persons report. She would later tell 48 Hours that she had asked her mother about Mary, and she told her the same story she had told Kathy, that Mary had simply run away. In some accounts, Charlotte reportedly said that Mary was also on drugs and had become a sex worker. She even stated that she had burned all photos of her eldest daughter. Kathy would later explain to her sibling, "We're not allowed to talk about Mary." After Sherry filed a missing persons report, little headway was made in Mary's case. An age-progressed photo of her was created and released, but it wasn't until 2002 that an official investigation into Mary's disappearance was opened. Police found that neighbors in Seaside did not remember the 13-year-old and didn't recognize her photo, and that while living in the town, Mary had not been enrolled at any school. Upon speaking with Kathy, investigators found even more information. She revealed that her sister had been beaten by their stepfather the night before her disappearance, causing her to bleed from her mouth. Notably, Kathy had been kicked out of the family home at the age of 14 and left to fend for herself. Sherry, meanwhile, reported to police that her mother had once told her that she knew of places in California where a body could be buried and never found. This led Sherry to believe that Mary had been murdered. Charlotte and William were inconsistent and untruthful when speaking with investigators. Charlotte appeared to know very little about her daughter's disappearance, other than that she ran away in 1981. She claimed that her husband had filed a missing report with the local police department, but no record of such a report existed. William claimed that he'd reported the girl missing to the police via a phone call, but again, there was no record of such a phone call. He later admitted to assaulting Mary the night before she vanished. Furthermore, in 1983, Charlotte reportedly lied to Sherry, claiming that she and William had gone to great lengths to locate Mary. They'd listed her missing, searched for her, and handed out flyers. But none of this was true. There was some speculation that the couple hadn't reported Mary missing because they were cashing her social security benefits at the time. In her interview with police, Charlotte reportedly stated, quote, "If Mary's dead, she's dead." Kathy also revealed to investigators that she and her siblings had been told not to go near a corner of the garden when they were playing outside. She directed authorities to the corner, and cadaver dogs reportedly picked up on the scent of human remains. A child's shoe was found when police dug, though human remains were not located. Cadaver dogs would later alert law enforcement to an area near the house where the family had lived in Fort Ord, leading authorities to speculate that the body buried in the family home in Seaside had been dug up and moved with them when they changed homes. Everything changed in 2005, however, while investigators were building a case against William and Charlotte. In November of that year, a vehicle was pulled over as part of a routine traffic stop. The truck had stolen license plates, and police asked the passengers for documentation. One passenger had an Arizona state ID, with the name Mary Day. It also had Mary's date of birth on it, as well as other important information. During an interview, the woman revealed that she was Mary Day, who had vanished in 1981 at the age of 13. She claimed that she'd run away from home to escape her abusive parents, but investigators were skeptical of her story because the woman had a thick southern accent, which Mary did not have as a young teen. Adding to police doubts was the fact that the Arizona ID had been issued 3 weeks before she was taken into custody, around the same time that the homicide investigation had begun. Investigators decided to test the woman's DNA and compare it to Charlotte's, which showed that she was indeed her biological daughter. Although police still seemed to have their doubts, they could not argue with the DNA evidence. Mary's sister, Sherry, invited her to live with her in North Carolina. The two reunited with Kathy. Questions continued to plague the case, however. Sherry and investigators didn't understand why Mary had such a thick southern accent, and Sherry noticed that her sister was receiving mail addressed to Monica Devereaux, although it's possible this was simply an alias Mary used as it had the same initials as her real name. Kathy also had some suspicions about Mary, because she didn't remember that their father had left them an inheritance, or that they used the code word Mohawk to refer to it. She also didn't recall William's accusations that she'd poisoned his dog. The police expressed concern over the case, suggesting that Mary was a biological child of Charlotte's, whom she and William had pose as Mary Day to avoid prosecution. They claimed that Charlotte had several affairs during her marriages and may have had a secret child. But then, in 2017, Mary revealed to a reporter that a woman named Marie Kimmel had taken her in shortly after she'd run away from home. Mary had lived with Marie for a year before running away again. Marie's relatives provided investigators with a photograph of Mary from 1982, proving that Charlotte and William did not kill her in 1981. Not only that, but Mary needed surgery in the months before she was found in 2005, which was the reason for her newly issued state ID, and that a local non-profit had helped track down her birth certificate in order for her to obtain the ID. Following this, investigators closed the case, and Sherry accepted that the woman calling herself Mary Day was, in fact, her sister. Mary died shortly afterwards in 2017 at the age of 49. Maria Lorraine Hansel. On the night of February 7th, 1977, officers with the Colorado Springs Police Department were called to the scene of a possible suicide in the 5400 block of North Nevada Avenue. When they arrived, they discovered a gruesome sight. Maria Lorraine Hansel, a 14-year-old girl, had been viciously stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck, her body left on the floor of the master bedroom in a pool of blood. It was clear with one glance that this was no suicide. This was cold-blooded murder. Maria Hansel lived nearby. She had been babysitting for her neighbor's 2 children on the night of the murder. The neighbor noted that she'd called the teenager earlier that night and everything had been fine, but when she arrived home at 11:20 p.m., Maria was dead. The only silver lining was that the other children, ages 6 and 8, were unharmed, asleep in their beds. Investigators were able to collect some interesting pieces of evidence from the scene, including blood from Maria's jumpsuit that wasn't hers. It was established as being male, but nothing further came of it in the next few decades. The horrific scene haunted investigators and locals for decades, with no answers in sight until nearly 50 years passed. On May 8th, 2024, the Colorado Springs PD announced that they'd finally established the identity of the man responsible for Maria's murder, William Charles Khn Jr. Khn had died in 2010 and had been cremated, and since he has no living relatives, investigators could not compare his DNA, but police are positive that Khn was responsible for Maria's death. Khn came to the attention of police in 2019 when they entered the DNA retrieved from the blood on Maria's jumpsuit into a public genetic genealogy database and compared it with other samples. At the time of the murders, Khn was a university student and familiar with the woman Maria was babysitting for when she was killed. He had also been to the apartment complex several times before. Why he killed Maria is unknown, but at long last, Maria's family at least have some of the answers they've been looking for 47 years. Angel Baby Doe. As recently as 2021, news outlets were printing the tragic story of a Jane Doe baby dubbed Angel Baby Doe. A newborn found dumped on the side of the road in Johnson County, Texas, Angel Baby Doe was discovered by a local collecting litter along Briar Oaks Road between Alvarado and Burleson on November 18, 2001. The baby was wrapped in a jacket, the umbilical cord still attached. The Johnson County Sheriff's Office later disclosed the little girl had been born alive, but noted that the mother had failed to receive medical care after giving birth and hadn't clamped the umbilical cord, leaving the baby to bleed to death. Over the years, investigators received numerous leads about the true identity of Angel Baby Doe. Several persons of interest were identified and examined, but none of their leads had ever panned out. In 2021, the Johnson County Sheriff's Office submitted evidence to Othram, the genetic genealogy company, which allowed them to develop a DNA profile for the baby and subsequently compare it to the samples on their database. Othram, as part of a news release, stated, "Using this new information, a follow-up investigation was conducted, leading investigators to potential relatives of the infant." In June this year, investigators announced a break in the case. They'd identified Angel Baby Doe's mother as 48-year-old Shelby Stotts and arrested her on a second-degree murder charge. Stotts was a paraprofessional at a high school at the time of her arrest, and she has declined to comment on the case in the months since. At this time, the circumstances of the baby's birth are unknown, as are the reasons why she subsequently abandoned the child. Therese Becker and Sherry Bridgewater. Therese Becker, 20, was last seen on December 4, 1975, in Westminster, Colorado. At the time of her disappearance, she was hitchhiking to see her boyfriend at the Adams County Jail in Brighton, Colorado. Therese had grown up in Wyoming and moved to the state after graduating from high school. Her family described her as a free spirit who never met a stranger and would hold a conversation with anyone. 2 days after she left to see her boyfriend, though, her body was discovered in a field near 100th Avenue. She never made it to the jail. She'd been dumped along with her clothing and other personal possessions. A post-mortem revealed that her cause of death had been asphyxiation. She had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. For years, the identity of Therese's killer evaded the police, and though her case was frequently reviewed by investigators, no new leads emerged. Then, in 2003, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation extracted unknown male DNA from a piece of evidence from the scene. This was a huge breakthrough in the case, only possible thanks to the advancements in DNA technology. But it didn't lead the authorities to their killer, as he wasn't on their DNA database. The case was back at square one. Then, in 2013, hopes were raised once again when it was discovered that the DNA from Therese's crime scene matched that from a separate crime being investigated in Las Vegas. The Las Vegas Metro Police were reviewing a cold case from 1991, the rape and murder of Sherry Bridgewater. Sherry had been found dead in her home in the 1000 block of West Monroe Avenue in May of that year. She was a 30-year-old mother at the time, and the killer had left her body positioned in a, quote, suspicious nature. Though investigators were able to establish that the same man had viciously assaulted and killed both Sherry and Therese, they still didn't have a name. Everything changed, however, in 2023, when the Colorado Bureau of Investigation enlisted the help of a genetic DNA lab and a genealogist company. With their aid, law enforcement managed to identify a suspect. The man was already deceased, but his body was exhumed for DNA testing. In February 2024, authorities announced that the cases of Sherry Bridgewater and Therese Becker were now closed, as they had established the identity of their killer as Thomas Martin Elliott, a career criminal who took his own life in 1991, some time after the Sherry Bridgewater murder. Elliot had spent his life in and out of the prison system. He spent time incarcerated for a vast array of crimes, including burglary and the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl. This assault saw him convicted in 1981 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Investigators believe that Elliot met Sherry while they both attended an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting shortly after his release from prison. Linda Sue Childers, formerly known as Lorraine Stahl. In May of 1974, the Connecticut State Police received a tip about a double murder that had taken place in a derelict property on Shoeville Road in the town of Ledyard, about 55 miles east of New Haven. Officers responded to the scene on May 30th, where they discovered 2 shallow graves in the garden at the back of the house. The bodies were badly decomposed, but determined to be of one woman and one man. They had been fatally shot, and the anonymous tipster had stated that the killings occurred 4 years earlier, on December 31st, 1970. It wasn't long before investigators were able to identify the deceased man as Gustavus Lee Carmichael, a convicted criminal who had escaped from federal custody before his death. He was 25 in 1970 and had robbed numerous banks across the country. His latest crime had been stealing $60,000 from a New Jersey bank, but his criminal history was lengthy. He had been convicted of all sorts of crimes, including breaking and entering, kidnapping, assault and battery, and grand larceny. Investigators believed that Carmichael met the woman he was killed alongside while on the run from the law. The perpetrators of the murders were soon caught. Richard DeFreitas and Donald Brandt confessed to the murders after being questioned by police. Reportedly, the 2 men, plus a third, owned several safe houses, which they used to hide escaped convicts from law enforcement. They'd also provided fugitives with false paperwork, identifying them as whatever new names they'd chosen for themselves. In 1970, DeFreitas had set up a safe house in Ledyard and provided paperwork to the couple, who were using the names Dirk and Lorraine Stahl. However, DeFreitas grew concerned when his wife told him that Lorraine was worried about the lifestyle she and her boyfriend were leading. This led him to speak with Brandt, and they thought it was best to kill Lorraine, out of the fear that she'd divulged their information to the police in an effort to get a better deal for herself and Carmichael. But when the 2 men went to confront Lorraine, Carmichael refused to let them kill her, so the 2 men killed them both instead and buried them on the property. Investigators concluded that Lorraine Stahl was not the true name of their Jane Doe, but they struggled to find answers. Inside the home, they found a phone book that she owned. It revealed that she'd made calls to various states across the country, including Tennessee, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, but this didn't help them find her name. At the scene, they also received a tan leather wet-look vest, a gold or tan sweater, a brown tweed skirt, and a pair of brown boots. She also wore a pendant and several rings, some with the letters JHSN and the initials ILN, as well as the date 1917 engraved inside. Another ring she had contained a fake emerald stone. For over 50 years, the real identity of Lorraine Stahl remained a mystery, but in July of 2022, authorities decided to send samples of her DNA to Othram, which led them to find a family member, her sister. The woman's sister revealed that she had a daughter, who provided them with a DNA sample so that investigators could be 100% sure. In March 2024, it was revealed that the name of the woman was Linda Sue Childers. She was 24 at the time of her death. Joanne Pedersen. 10-year-old Joanne Pedersen was walking home with her sister on the night of February 19, 1983, when the pair got into a fight. As the 2 siblings were home alone that night, Joanne's sister ran to the house and locked the door, locking the 10-year-old out of their residence in Chilliwack, British Columbia, Canada. Joanne, though, was unfazed by her sister's actions. She decided to make the short walk to the Penny Pincher's store located near Vedder and Watson Roads. Inside, the young girl spoke with a shop clerk before heading back to use the nearby payphone. She asked the operator to connect her with her parents. The phone call that night is one of the most bizarre parts of this case. In an interview 2 days after Joanne went missing, Her mother, Angela, recalled taking the phone call. She stated, "Joanne phoned and said, 'Come and pick me up.' She added that she then heard a man's voice on the line who told her, 'You'd better get here within half an hour or I'm phoning the police.' Angela noted, 'I was there between 15 and 20 minutes, but by the time Joanne's parents arrived at the phone booth, there was no sign of the 10-year-old. Witnesses would later report seeing a man inside the phone booth. Retired Global News reporter John Daly remembered the horrific case and the subsequent Crime Stoppers recreation of events, stating, "To see a little girl in a rainy phone booth, cars passing by, talking to some guy in a black coat, it was just horrible." The man was described as being between 20 and 30 years old, between 5'6" and 5'7", and with a slim to medium build. His hair was below his ears, and he was clean-shaven. Following Joanne's disappearance, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an extensive search for her. Scent dogs and hundreds of volunteers painstakingly combed through the area for any sign of the 10-year-old, but no evidence was ever recovered. For decades, Joanne's case lay dormant. In 2008, her mother and the RCMP released a video in which she pleaded with the man seen in the phone booth to come forward and identify himself. By this point, investigators did not believe he was responsible for the disappearance, but noted that he was an important witness and they needed to speak with him. In her plea, Angela stated, "Please come forward. As a mother, I'm pleading for you to come forward. Please do that for me." Then, in August 2011, what seemed like a break in the case finally came when the Chilliwack RCMP received an anonymous, handwritten letter. The writer included significant information which indicated that it came from someone involved with the case, with Corporal Tammy Hollingsworth from Upper Fraser Valley RCMP noting, quote, "There's certain details, I guess, in the letter that only this person would know." She added that they really needed to speak with the letter writer and encouraged them to step forward. However, they never did. Notably, it has also emerged that the man seen with Joanne in the phone booth did contact the police in 2008. However, he did so by writing an anonymous letter. Investigators maintained their belief that the man was attempting to help the 10-year-old and was not involved in the crime. They added that they didn't believe the writers of the two letters were the same person. Once more, over a decade went by with no further answers. It wasn't until 2023 that the RCMP announced that they had been able to ID the man in the phone booth and rule him out as a suspect. The man's name has not been made public. Retired reporter John Daly noted, "One can only wonder what they told him and why it took so long to find him and why he didn't come forward earlier. Or have they discovered who he was, determined who he was, and he's dead? We don't know." The RCMP stated that they have not lost hope that they will solve the case, which is still open and active today. Joanne Pedersen was just 10 when she disappeared from Chilliwack, British Columbia on February 19, 1983. She is described as a white female with brown hair and brown eyes, with a 1-inch birthmark behind her right ear. At the time of her disappearance, she was wearing a blue sweatshirt, tan capri trousers, a yellow t-shirt, and a pink sleeveless jacket. She was 4'6" and around 85 pounds when she vanished. If she is still alive today, Joanne will be 51 years old. If you have any information about Joanne's case, you can contact the Chilliwack RCMP at 604-792-4611 or Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477. Frauke Liebs. 21-year-old Frauke Liebs was last seen on Tuesday, June 20th, 2006 in Paderborn, Germany. The nursing student had been enjoying a day with her friends at an Irish pub named the Old Triangle, in which they watched the FIFA World Cup match between Sweden and England. At some point during the evening, though, Frauke's mobile had run out of battery, and she borrowed a friend's battery so she could use her phone. She had been texting an unnamed acquaintance most of the night. She returned the battery shortly before departing from the pub at around 11 p.m. Frauke was known to be carrying about €5 with her and was heading home on foot. She lived less than a mile from the Old Triangle, but despite the short distance she was travelling, she never made it home. Less than 2 hours later, at 12:49 a.m., her flatmate, Chris, received a text message from Frauke's mobile stating that she was going to be back home later. Still, as the hours passed, the 21-year-old never appeared. Her mother reported her missing when she failed to turn up for class the following day. Investigators later established that the text message sent to Chris had been sent from Neheim, a small city 21 miles from Paderborn. Though nobody saw the 21-year-old in the following days, she did, surprisingly, call Chris 5 times from her mobile. All calls were determined to have come from various industrial areas of Paderborn. The exact motivation behind these phone calls remains unclear, though. Frauke would repeatedly tell Chris that she would be home soon, but she never explained where she was, what had happened to her, or even if she was safe. She often provided vague answers and tried to avoid responding to certain questions. The vast majority of the phone calls were less than 1 minute long, except her final one. On June 27th, Frauke called again. She had not called the day before. During this final call, both Chris and Frauke's sister were present, and the exchange lasted over 5 minutes. When asked if she was being held captive, Frauke faintly responded with yes, but immediately followed it with a loud, audible no. The phone call was ended afterwards, and Frauke was never heard from again. Months passed, and no further contact came. The summer faded into autumn, and it was then, on October 4th, that Frauke's body was found in a wooded area near Lichtenau, around 9 miles southeast of Paderborn. The remains were so badly decomposed that the cause of death could not be determined, nor could the time of death. Frauke was still wearing the clothing she was last seen in, but her mobile, handbag, purse, and watch were not found at the scene, and have never been recovered. No DNA, tire tracks, or any other useful evidence was located by investigators. During the investigation, over 700 leads were followed and over 900 people were questioned, but still, the identity of Frauke's killer remains unknown. Detectives managed to put together a list of suspects containing the names of 5 individuals, but each individual was eventually ruled out after producing an alibi. 2 men were cleared of being involved in the crime in 2023 after their old mobile phones were extensively examined and their DNA had been taken. Their homes had been thoroughly searched 1 year prior, and the public prosecutor eventually conceded that there was no evidence tying the two to Frauke's murder. Though her case was featured on case number XY Unsolved, Germany's equivalent to Crime Watch or America's Most Wanted, no leads ever arose. Investigators believe that Frauke possibly knew her killer and willingly entered their car. They have suggested that she was held captive in Neheim, where the text to Chris had originated, and that the killer had subsequently moved Frauke around at night in Paderborn so that she could make the phone calls to her flatmate, possibly in an attempt to throw off the police. Forensic psychiatrist Nala Seimer told German magazine Stern that she believes the perpetrator was a male under the age of 45 at the time. She added that he was likely calm, a meticulous planner, and somebody who was of either normal or above average intelligence. She also suggested that the crime was well planned and theorized that he had allowed Frauke to contact her flatmate to reassure him that she was okay, which, in turn, would hopefully delay police interference. Frauke's mother, Ingrid, believes somebody knows what happened to her daughter, but so far, answers have continued to elude both Frauke's loved ones and law enforcement. Loren Ran. Lorraine Ran had been left alone in her and her mother's third-floor apartment on Merrimack Street in Manchester, New Hampshire on April 26, 1980. Her mother, Judith, was dating a professional tennis player at the time, so the couple had left town for a sports tournament, with Judith trusting Lorraine to stay out of trouble while she was gone. At the time of her disappearance, Lorraine was described as troubled. The 14-year-old was known to be outgoing and a good student, and she harbored dreams of making it as an actress, but she had recently begun spending a lot of time alone, walking the streets late at night. She had developed a taste for alcohol and smoking pot, and had even mentioned running away from home on more than one occasion. Her aunt called her an angel who hung around the wrong people for a while. On the evening of April 26th, knowing it would be very late before her mother returned, Lorraine invited 2 friends over, one male and one female. The trio consumed a 6-pack of beer and a bottle of wine. Her friends later suggested that she'd worked at the local convenience store, restocking the wine coolers in exchange for alcohol. Eventually, the female friend took herself off to bed, leaving Lorraine and her male friend awake, chatting on the sofa. At around 12:30 a.m., the pair heard voices outside in the building's hallway, steadily getting closer. The male friend panicked, assuming Judith had returned home, and to avoid getting Lorraine into trouble, he left out the back door. He later told investigators that he heard Lorraine lock the door behind him as he left. A neighbor confirmed that there had been voices in the hallway around this time, and that they'd approached Lorraine's apartment before it went quiet. Judith and her boyfriend arrived home less than an hour later, at around 1:15 a.m. Immediately, things seemed a little off. The light bulbs on all 3 of the building's floors had been unscrewed, leaving the hallways in complete darkness. Then, upon reaching the apartment, Judith noticed that the door was unlocked. Still, despite these oddities, Judith wasn't too alarmed, especially when she peered into her daughter's still, dark bedroom and saw a figure sound asleep in bed. Moments later, though, Judith's boyfriend noticed that the back door was open. Confused, the mother of one went to wake Lorraine to question her, but was surprised to find that the bed contained her daughter's friend. There was no sign of Lorraine. The young girl explained that Lorraine had been in bed with her but had taken a pillow and blanket earlier in the night and gone to sleep on the sofa. The friend later reported being too drunk to remember much of the night's events. Checking around the apartment, Judith located Lorraine's bag and her new trainers in the living room. There were no signs of struggle throughout the home, and none of Lorraine's possessions were missing. The 14-year-old had vanished. While Judith's boyfriend went to search the neighborhood, she stayed behind to contact family, friends, and neighbors. Nobody had seen the young girl. At 3:45 a.m., Judith flagged down a passing police car and reported her daughter missing. Initially, investigators treated Lorraine as a runaway, given her troubled behavior. But as the weeks passed and they realized she wasn't coming home, they began to suggest other possibilities. They speculated that she'd left the apartment briefly, but that something had gone awry. This theory came when a bus employee believed he'd sold Lorraine a ticket on the night of her disappearance, while a bus driver thought he'd dropped her off in Park Square, Boston. However, when shown a more recent photograph of the 14-year-old, the driver was unable to confirm if it was Lorraine he'd seen. Throughout the remainder of 1981, and beginning shortly after the disappearance, Judith received eerie phone calls. Each night, the phone would ring at 3:45 a.m., and although Judith always answered, nobody spoke on the other end of the line. The calls increased during the Christmas period and continued for several years after Lorraine went missing. They only stopped when Judith changed her phone number. Notably though, Lorraine's mother wasn't the only one to get strange phone calls. One of her aunts, Janet Roy, noted that a young girl called her home looking to speak with Mike, Lorraine's cousin. Lorraine was the only one to refer to her cousin as Mike, and when he came to the phone, the caller never spoke. This happened several times. Then, in 1986, the mother of Roger Mores, a friend of Lorraine's, received a phone call from a woman calling herself Lori or Lorraine. The woman claimed to be a former girlfriend and asked to speak with Roger. Notably, Lorraine and Roger dated briefly when they were 12 years old. Though Roger wasn't available at the time, he later stated in 1990 that he believed the call was from Lorraine, stating, "It had to be her. I think she ran away. I think she's alive." Notably, Detective Lucas Hobbs, the current cold case investigator, has stated that there are no records of these calls in Lorraine's official police file. Initially, the investigation was quiet, with detectives having little to go on. It wasn't until November of 1980 that a break came, when Judith discovered she'd been billed for 3 calls placed in California 1 month earlier. She had no friends or relatives in the state, and nor did her daughter. 2 of the calls had been placed from a motel in Santa Monica, and another from a motel in Santa Ana. One of the calls had been made to a hotline designed to help teenagers with questions about sex. Though investigators spoke with the doctor who ran the hotline, He denied knowing anything about Lorraine or the phone call. However, in 1985, he changed his story. He claimed that young women and runaways often approached his wife for help at the couple's home, and added that Lorraine was possibly one of those girls. He described the girl he thought might have been Lorraine as being from New Hampshire in the company of an older woman, and claimed that she had later moved to New York. He then stated that Annie Sprinkle, a sex educator and former porn star, may have information about Lorraine. Sprinkle was said to know his wife through the fashion industry. No evidence has ever been found connecting her to the case, however. A year later, in 1986, an investigator visited the two motels where the California calls had come from. They determined that one of them may have been used as a filming location by a child pornographer known only as Dr. Z. However, it's unclear as to whether or not he has any connection to the teen hotline or the case at large. There has been some fear that Lorraine was trafficked, but no evidence has been found. There were several sightings of Lorraine after she vanished. One in Boston, Massachusetts in 1981, another in Anchorage, Alaska in 1988, but they have never been confirmed. There were also several disappearances of young women and girls around New Hampshire during the early 1980s, but none of the cases have been conclusively linked to Lorraine's. Lorraine's case has never been solved. In 1985, 5 years after she went missing, the male friend she had been drinking with on the night of her disappearance committed suicide. Investigators do not believe him to have been involved in the case. Meanwhile, Judith moved to Florida several years after her daughter vanished. She has maintained the belief that Lorraine made those California calls in October of 1980, noting that between her dreams of becoming an actress and her love for hot weather, California would have greatly appealed to the 14-year-old. Though Judith hired 2 PIs in the early 1980s who investigated for 3 to 4 months, they had little to show for it. They came up with nothing, she later stated. She noted that she has never stopped looking for Lorraine, adding that she thinks of her every single day. 14-year-old Loren Ran was last seen on April 26, 1980 in Manchester, New Hampshire. She is described as a white female with brown hair and brown eyes and was 5'4" and weighed 90 pounds when she was last seen. Lorraine has light brown birthmarks under each eye and a scar on her upper leg from falling on broken glass when she was younger. At the time of her disappearance, she was wearing a white V-neck sweatshirt, blue plaid blouse, jeans, brown shoes, a heart-shaped gold ring, and a silver and blue necklace. If she is still alive, she will be 58 years old. If you have any information about Lorraine's disappearance, you can contact the Manchester Police Department at 603-668-8711. Arouge Khan. 46-year-old Arouge Khan was an Indian immigrant living in Chicago since the 1980s. Described by his wife, Shabana Ansari, as a workaholic and a generous man, Arouge had built a brilliant life for himself in the US, opening up his first dry cleaning shop in 2004 and expanding his business over the next few years. Following his business success, he kicked his gambling habit, which mostly consisted of buying lottery tickets, and purchased multiple properties, most of which he let out. But everything changed for Arouge and his loved ones when he decided to buy 2 $30 scratch cards from a 7-Eleven in June of 2012, despite having vowed to stop. Upon scratching off his tickets, he yelled, "I hit $1 million!" He subsequently opted for a lump sum payment of about $600,000, around $425,000 after taxes. Since Illinois requires most winning ticket holders to appear for a news conference, partially to prove that the state pays out its prizes, Arouge went with his wife and daughter to collect his oversized check and pose for photographs. The event wasn't well attended, but by all accounts, the 46-year-old was very excited about his winnings, pledging to donate to St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital and put some of the money into his business. He stated, "Winning the lottery means everything to me." That night he had dinner with his wife, his daughter, and his father-in-law. Just hours later, though, he would be rushed to hospital. The next day he was pronounced dead. He was believed to have died from an arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and nobody even considered ordering an autopsy because his death did not seem suspicious. The forensic pathologist who worked the case found no signs of trauma, and his blood work returned no opiates, alcohol, or carbon monoxide, leading to the ruling that his death was natural. Arouge's family, though, found his death to be suspicious, in particular his brother, Imtiaz Khan, who pleaded with authorities to take another look at the case, concerned that something was afoot because there were tensions in the family over Arouge's lottery win. Further testing revealed that Arouge had been given a fatal dose of cyanide, which caused the Chicago police to launch a homicide investigation and have the 46-year-old's body exhumed. Further examinations of the body, which included testing samples of the lungs, liver, and spleen, were inconclusive, however. While toxicology revealed there was cyanide in Arouge's blood, it was not found in his tissues or digestive system. The only thing found was a non-specific residue. However, experts have noted that the cyanide was likely no longer in the body, as it had been 6 months since his burial, stating, "Cyanide has a short half-life and may be lost over the post-mortem interval unless tissues are adequately preserved. In this case, due to the advanced putrefaction of the tissues, no cyanide was detected." Despite this new information, answers in Arouge's case never came. His brother expressed his frustration, stating, "I keep getting the same answer. They are looking for a witness. How long is it going to take? Who could be the witness?" A police source, however, said that the investigation was at a standstill because they believed someone close to the 46-year-old may know more than they are letting on. Since Arouge left no will, his family members fought over his estate. Ultimately, his daughter was given around $250,000 worth of property and 1/3 of his lottery winnings. His widow was given the dry cleaning business, worth over $1 million, and 2/3 of his winnings. Tensions between family members had been raised around the time that Arouge won the lottery. The IRS reportedly went to his home in 2011 to collect $120,000 in back taxes that his father-in-law owed, but were unable to gather the money. Following his death, Arouge's brother worried that his daughter, Jasmine, may not get her fair share of her father's assets, prompting him to take his brother's widower to court over the estate. After Arouge died, Jasmine, who was his daughter from a previous marriage, moved in with his sister and her husband. Arouge's widow, who was 32 at the time of his death, stated, "I want the truth to come out in the investigation. The sooner, the better. Who could be that person who hurt him?" She added, "It has been an incredibly hard time. We went from being the happiest the day we got the check. It was the best sleep I've had. And the next day, everything was gone." Arouge's case is still unsolved. The St. Croix Voodoo Murders. On the night of November 18th, 1988, authorities on the island of St. Croix were called to the scene of a minor traffic accident. A local woman named Radha Maharaj was the victim of the crime, seeming to have suffered from internal injuries. She was quickly transported to the hospital, but died en route. That same night, about 16 miles from the traffic accident, the body of a man was found. Chillingly, the man was Radha's husband, Krishnadath. The clothing of both individuals was soaked in seawater, and it was discovered that they'd both succumbed to cyanide poisoning. Adding further mystery to their deaths was the fact that around $25,000 in cash that the couple had purportedly borrowed was missing. Cyanide poisoning on the island was rare, but the deaths of the Maharajas brought the number up to 5 since 1984. Since the poison was used so infrequently, investigators began to suspect that all 5 deaths were linked, and possibly connected to voodoo or obeah rituals. While voodoo is not inherently dangerous, hexes and curses are used in what is called obeah. The unidentified killer of the couple, and the man responsible for 3 other murders on the island, has been dubbed the Obeah Man. Authorities believe that this man pretends to be a practitioner of voodoo rituals and agrees to perform in exchange for money. In the months leading up to their deaths, the Maharajas, who owned a local grocery store, took out a loan to help expand their business. However, they struggled to pay it back. According to Radha's daughters, who helped run the store, the couple began receiving daily phone calls from an unidentified man. He would ask to speak with their stepfather, who would then tell them to wait outside while he spoke to the caller in private. 3 weeks before the couple were killed, they brought home $25,000 in cash, which they had borrowed from numerous relatives. When asked about the cash, Radha told their daughters that they needed the money to pay the harassing caller. She gave no identifying information about the man, nor any further details about the arrangement. One of the daughters recalled, "They were very tense, especially when I spoke to my mother about what they were doing. She didn't like for me to ask some of those things, and she tried to answer me as quickly as possible and then changed the subject." In a separate instance, the girls questioned their mother again. She told us that this is what they had to pay the gentleman, so I asked her, "Well, why?" She said, "Well, don't ask me any questions. By Monday, you will know what it's all about." On the day of the murders, Radha left the family home at 7:30 p.m. and drove her car east. Her daughters noticed because it was out of character for her to go off by herself at night. Their stepfather followed suit at 8 p.m., driving his car in the opposite direction. The events of the next few hours are unclear until 9:30 p.m., when Radha's vehicle was spotted near a local beach. It was described as coasting with nobody controlling it. When authorities showed up, they found her unconscious and near death. Krishnandath, meanwhile, was discovered wearing just his trousers. At first glance, there was some suspicion of suicide, a result of their struggling business and difficult financial situation. But when the results came in that the couple had died of cyanide poisoning, it was clear that there was a link between these murders and the previous cyanide poisoning deaths. The first poisoning took place in 1984. The victim was 38-year-old Haig Caesar, who was found dead in his car on the morning of May 24th, with the post-mortem concluding that he had died from cyanide poisoning. Over the course of their investigation, authorities learned that in the weeks leading up to his death, Haig had connected with an unknown man who had told him that there were jars of coins hidden around his property. He said that spirits guarded the jars and he could help get rid of them. It would cost Haig $100,000. Once he had enough money, the man said, he could give Haig a potion to help him find the coins. Law enforcement suspects that this potion contained the cyanide which killed Haig. His wife later explained, "When I found out about all the money he was borrowing and all the cash that he had taken out of our accounts and everything without even letting me know, I was really very angry about it. I was shocked overall, just shocked that he would have taken it so far." The second poisoning occurred 2 years later, in 1986. Edsel Stryden and Carmen Torres, like the Maharajas, were small business owners who had a local bar and had recently taken out a loan. Edsel and Carmen took their loan in $54,000 worth of cash. On September 13th, they climbed into their car and drove off. 3 hours later, Carmen was found dead about half a mile from where Radha was discovered in 1989. Her partner was located in a truck at a nearby beach. Both Carmen and Edsel had died from cyanide poisoning, and their $54,000 in cash was missing. Little progress has been made in the cases since the 1980s. The murders have never been solved, and the killer remains at large. Authorities have no description of him, other than that he has a heavy French West Indian accent. They added that he likely travels throughout the US, as well as the Caribbean. Paty Wright. 43-year-old Paty Wright was described as a head-turner with a big smile and an easy laugh. A talented equestrian, she was also a savvy and wealthy businesswoman who owned the Great Southwest Wax Museum and had recently purchased a 30-acre ranch in Aledo, Texas, where she planned to keep her horses and live a more rural lifestyle. On the night of October 22nd, 1987, Patsy drove to her home in Arlington after a rehearsal for the Wax Museum's Halloween show, but she was unable to sleep. At around 3 a.m., she took a dose of NyQuil in the hopes that it would tire her out, but unbeknownst to Patsy, it had been laced with strychnine, a colourless and bitter substance that is known to produce incredibly painful reactions in humans. Symptoms of exposure to the poison include muscle spasms and full-body convulsions, hypothermia, unconsciousness, and paralysis of the neural pathways, which leads to asphyxiation. Those exposed to strychnine typically die within 2 to 3 hours. It is generally considered an exceptionally cruel method of murder. The following day, friends and family were alerted to the news that Patsy had died. Her daughter, Leslie, recalled the moment that she learned of her mother's death. She was so alive, she was so healthy, there was nothing wrong with her, and when it happened, you're just in awe, because you would never ever have expected that to happen to her. It was Patsy's sister and brother-in-law who'd made the discovery. Sally Horning had been woken up in the early hours of the morning by a phone call from her sister, who told her that she'd taken some cold medicine and was feeling unwell, before collapsing while still on the phone. Sally woke her husband, and the two rushed to the 43-year-old's home, breaking down the door and finding her in the bedroom. Sally recalled, "She just looked like she had kind of fainted, and so I thought, that's what's happened. And so we tried to get her up, and that didn't work." Since nothing was amiss at the scene, nobody was aware at the time that Patsy's death had been intentional. It wasn't until after her funeral that a routine post-mortem was carried out, revealing that she had been poisoned with strychnine. Since Sally mentioned that her sister had consumed cold medicine before bed, the bottle in her home was tested, showing that it contained the poison. Notably, the strychnine used in the killing was in pure powder form, the most concentrated type available. Few retailers sold such a thing, and investigators hoped that someone would remember making the sale, but it doesn't appear that anyone ever came forward. Law enforcement ruled out product tampering and suicide, and labelled the death a homicide. Authorities found it suspicious that Patsy's burglar alarm had not been set on the night she died, and also observed that only those close to the 43-year-old were aware of her habit of taking cold medication when she couldn't sleep. Initially, police were very wary of Sally and Steve. They noted that Sally and Patsy owned the Wax Museum together, and now the 43-year-old was dead, it would be run by the married couple, giving them a very handsome income. Friends had also told the police that Patsy didn't like Steve, accusing him of spending Sally's inheritance and putting the couple into debt. She attempted to make arrangements should anything happen to her or Sally, wherein Steve would not get their money from the museum or inherit the museum itself, but died several weeks before she could speak to Sally about her feelings. The day before she died, she reportedly stated that she didn't want Steve anywhere around her. Investigators also knew, though, that Steve had attempted to resuscitate his sister-in-law by giving her mouth-to-mouth, and they knew that if he was the killer, it would be risky to do so, knowing there was poison in her system. Steve had told paramedics that during CPR, a lot of green fluid came up from her, and I would continually spit that out onto the bed, or there was a towel there, as I remember. But paramedics disputed Steve's statements, claiming that clear liquid came out of Patsy's mouth, not green, and one paramedic in particular argued that Steve did not correctly perform the CPR, causing some suspicion that Steve had purposely not carried out correct CPR, or that he and Sally had lied about him doing any at all. Several family members, including Sally and Steve, were issued polygraph tests. They all passed. Patsy's ex-husband, Robert Cox, was also interviewed. He was given the option to take a polygraph but declined. Police found Robert an interesting character because Patsy had sought out a restraining order against him, claiming he had been harassing her during their separation, including telling her that he knew people who could snuff someone out. Patsy was also due to testify against Robert, who was engaged in a civil suit with his insurance company. He had been accused of purposely setting fire to his warehouse in 1983, and Patsy's testimony, by all accounts, was a real spanner in the works for Robert. She died just over a week before the trial began, and Robert won the case. Still, no evidence was found to connect Robert to Patsy's death. The only real clue in the case, besides the laced cold medicine, was the possibility that someone had been with Patsy that night, which police felt was indicated by the 2 empty dinner plates on a tray near her bed. Authorities speculated that she had had someone over before bed that night, someone who presumably knew her well, since they were over so late. One report does state that Patsy had a boyfriend of sorts, but it's unclear if he was the individual who was there that night, as she was also seeing other people. Another suspect in the case was Bill and Bonnie Alexander, the couple who boarded Patsy's horses. Her family suspected the pair when they learned that the horses were in their name rather than Patsy's, and that they received a check from Patsy the day before her death. The Alexanders filled in the amount as $4,000, even though a friend recalled that they'd asked Patsy if she had any outstanding checks. The friend was helping the 43-year-old with her finances, and she said that she didn't. Bonnie Alexander claimed that the horses were in their names to prevent Steve from gaining access to them should anything happen to Patsy, and added that the $4,000 check was to cover not just boarding fees, but also contest entry fees. Patsy's family, meanwhile, have suggested that Bill Alexander took a shine to her and killed her when she rejected him. It's unclear why they think this, though, as there is no evidence to support the theory. There isn't even any evidence that their relationship was anything but professional. The only thing investigators could think that would have a potential link to the Alexanders is that strychnine was sometimes used to treat horses. Ultimately, the Alexanders took polygraph tests and passed, which seemed to satisfy authorities. The final suspect in the case was a former boyfriend of Patsy's named Leo Fikes. Leo was the owner of a chemical company, leading to some speculation that he may have had access to the poison. Furthermore, the relationship reportedly broke down after Patsy told Leo that she didn't want to get married. An anonymous caller informed police that Leo had dated an Arlington woman who had been murdered in 1987, though it doesn't seem that much came from this. Leo claimed that he had not been close to Patsy in months, and that when he'd seen her, it was out in public in passing. Investigators later determined that Leo's company didn't manufacture or have access to strychnine, and he passed a polygraph test. The day after Patsy died, a woman called her daughter and asked to speak with the 43-year-old. When Leslie told her her mother was unavailable, the caller ignored her and insisted she speak with Patsy. Finally, Leslie said that her mother had died recently. The caller reportedly responded, "Well, good, I wanted her dead." Leslie subsequently hung up the phone. It's unclear to this day if that was a prank call or something more sinister. Patsy and Sally's wax museum burned down in 1988. While it was initially suspected that a faulty electrical box caused the fire, the cause was later changed from accidental to undetermined, with some investigators believing that arson may have been the cause due to how quickly it spread, though no tests were done to find out if an accelerant was used. The original investigation files were stolen from a locked drawer in a locked room at the Grand Prairie Fire Department. They have never been found. Patsy's murder and the exact nature of the later warehouse fire remain unsolved. Mary Margaret Cook. 25-year-old Mary Margaret Cook was last seen on November 14th, 1970. Mary was a married mother of 2 at the time of her disappearance, having tied the knot with her husband, Lethen Earl Cook, 8 years earlier, when she was just 17. A stay-at-home mother, Mary kept the couple's house up to spec and cared for the children, while Earl earned his living as a painter. He would often leave the couple's home in Highland City, Florida, and travel during the week for various jobs before returning for the weekend. Mary was last seen leaving the couple's residence in Highland City to go Christmas shopping at the J.M. Fields store in Lakeland, but she never returned. According to her Doe Network page, she had backed out of a family camping trip that weekend because her husband had called to tell her he'd be home. Mary's vehicle, a white 1959 Cadillac, was found abandoned in the store's car park the day after she was last seen, and shortly after she was reported missing. It contained her wallet and handbag, but the $200 Earl claimed to have given her for the presents was missing. Additionally, Mary's wedding rings were found at the house. This was unusual as she wore them every day and rarely removed them. Investigators were unable to find any witnesses. It seemed that the 25-year-old had never entered the store. Law enforcement has been very open about the fact they consider Mary's husband, Earl, the prime suspect in her case, though they've never been able to concretely tie him to the disappearance. Over the years, he has been extensively interviewed, and in 2003, authorities dug up the garage floor of the house the couple lived in 1970, searching for clues. Police reported, "We believe there's a possibility that Miss Cook may have been disposed of in her yard." No evidence was found, however. Earl, meanwhile, maintains his innocence. He told their two young boys, aged 3 and 5 when Mary vanished, that their mother had left of her own volition. He remarried 2 years after Mary went missing. Eventually, that marriage dissolved, and he married a third time shortly afterwards. He died in 2007, aged 66. Despite Earl's stories, neither of the children believe that their mother just up and left for a new life. Their eldest son has told investigators that he saw his parents arguing on the day of the disappearance. He also recalled that, at one point, his father told him not to look outside. He has theorized that his mother's body was concealed in a red blanket, which he saw his father retrieve from the house. Following Mary's disappearance, the boys stayed with their maternal grandmother. However, when she found out Earl was under investigation, she confronted him and bluntly asked if he'd killed her daughter. Earl, though, didn't reply. Instead, he took the children and left. In the years since, there has been some speculation that Mary's disappearance is linked to that of another young mother, Peggy Byers-Baisden. 23-year-old Peggy went missing from Highland City on April 2nd, 1965, after heading out to a bar. She was reportedly seen in the bar's car park that evening, accompanied by an unidentified white man, and was having car trouble. Both Peggy and her vehicle have been missing ever since. Peggy was divorced when she disappeared and was working as a waitress. Her children were raised by her sister and brother-in-law after she went missing. Investigators have never identified a suspect. Despite the two women having some similarities, they were of similar ages, lived in the same city, were both mothers, and both had vanished after leaving their homes. Nothing further has linked these two cases. Authorities do not believe the two women knew each other, and Mary's case seems much more open and shut compared to Peggy's. 25-year-old Mary Cook was last seen in Highland City, Florida, on November 14, 1970. She is described as a half-white, half-Native American woman with brown hair and blue or hazel eyes. She is 4'11" and weighed around 145 to 150 pounds when she disappeared. She was possibly wearing a green dress when she went missing. Mary requires glasses to see and often wears cat eye frames, and she has a birthmark on the outside of her right leg above her ankle. Her Charlie Project and Doe Network pages note that she may have been pregnant when she went missing. If you have any information about Mary's disappearance, or that of Peggy, you can leave a tip with the Polk County Crime Stoppers at 1-800-226-8477, or call the Polk County Sheriff's Office at 800-226-0344. Melvin and Florence Shoemaker. The case of Florence Shoemaker, a 76-year-old woman who vanished from Ravenna, Ohio in February of 2003, is a strange one indeed, especially when you consider that her ex-husband, Melvin, disappeared almost a decade earlier in 1994. Melvin Shoemaker was last seen in Parkman, Ohio on April 11th, 1994. Though he took his wallet and keys, he left behind most of his other personal possessions, including his vehicles. According to the Charlie Project, Melvin had a strained relationship with the couple's son, Glenn Roger Shoemaker. Less than 2 decades earlier, in 1978, Melvin noted in a diary that he had almost been fired from his job after his son and wife had locked him inside the house and forbidden him from going to work. He wrote that he was, quote, tied up and chained in the basement at times during the month. On one occasion, he was able to escape, but his son caught him up and sprayed him in the face with mace. Glenn subsequently threatened to kill him and hide his body somewhere where it could never be found. That same year, Melvin and Florence separated and eventually divorced. Police have noted that there are allegations that Melvin abused Florence prior to their split. Melvin was living alone at the time of his disappearance in April of 1994. Neighbors recalled that he lived a hermit-like life. He had no telephone and no television, but he was polite and generous with his neighbors and enjoyed helping the community. Though neighbors told the police after 6 days that they hadn't seen Melvin, who was 70 in 1994, it has been noted that Glenn declined to report his father missing for some time. Police checked out Melvin's home, but found it to be in order. There was no sign of a struggle, nor any evidence of a break-in. As previously mentioned, the vast majority of his belongings remained in the home. Just his wallet and keys were missing. He left behind around $700,000 in assets. Several months after Melvin vanished, investigators searched Glenn's home for evidence. They found 11 guns and a massive amount of ammunition, and search dogs also alerted officers to 3 spots in the basement floor, a sign that something may have been buried there. Despite this, the basement floor was never excavated. Florence, meanwhile, was last seen on February 3rd, 2003, in Ravenna, Ohio. She was reportedly much closer with her son than Melvin was, and even lived with him at this time. But despite this, he failed to report her missing, and told anyone who asked after her that she was out of town taking care of a patient, as she had previously worked as a home health aide. She was only found to be missing when police were unable to contact her while reinvestigating her ex-husband's disappearance in 2005. According to reports, Florence was in poor health at the time she went missing. She was 76 years old, often appeared unkempt, and struggled to get around by herself. Law enforcement is unsure as to whether or not Florence and Melvin's cases are related, but there is a lot of suspicion that their son, who is now 68, was involved in either one or both of the disappearances. In 2018, Glenn's 40-acre farm property was searched. It seems that little came of this search, but police did notice that despite the fact that Glenn received the bulk of Melvin's assets, he was living with no electricity, no running water, and no telephone. The floors of his home were just dirt, and police reported that he had padlocks on the outside of the doors. The house is said to be in disrepair, inside and out. Melvin Shoemaker has been missing since April 11th, 1994 from Parkman, Ohio. He is described as a white male with graying brown hair and brown eyes. He was 70 when he vanished and had a short beard at the time. He is around 5'9" and weighed between 200 and 250 pounds when he was last seen. His ex-wife, Florence, was last seen on February 3rd, 2003, in Ravenna, Ohio. She is described as a white woman with brown hair and blue eyes. She is 5'7" and was around 155 pounds when she went missing. She was 76 at the time of her disappearance, and her maiden name is Converse. Anyone with information on the disappearance of Melvin Shoemaker or his ex-wife Florence can contact the Portage County Sheriff's Office at 330-296-5100. Terry and Allan Westerfield. 11-year-old Terry Westerfield and his 7-year-old brother Allan were last seen in Fayetteville, North Carolina on September 12, 1964, when their stepfather dropped them off at the Broadway Theatre on Hay Street to see a double feature. The details of how or when they disappeared are murky at best. It's unclear if the boys entered the theatre before going missing, or if they vanished from the streets. Even eyewitness testimony struggles to shed light on the finer case details, as some theatre workers recalled seeing the boys inside, but others didn't. Since they were regular customers at the cinema, they would have been easily recognizable. Investigators interviewed the brothers' stepfather, Carl Bock, just after their disappearance, since he was the last one to have seen them alive. He claimed that he dropped the children off at around 4 p.m., and when he went to pick them up several hours later, at 8 o'clock, he was unable to find them. Notably, however, Bock stated that he waited inside his parked vehicle until 9:30 p.m. He did not get out to search for the children and didn't enter the theatre to ask staff if they'd seen them. It wasn't until later that night at 2 a.m. that the boys' mother reported them missing. She and Bock were separated at the time. Law enforcement, including Fayetteville police, Fort Bragg authorities, and dozens of others aided in the extensive search for the two young boys. While tip after tip made its way to investigators, no real leads ever emerged. Investigators looked into specific cars seen in specific neighborhoods, including a reportedly strange and unidentified vehicle seen near the boys' home before they went missing, and they interviewed numerous individuals who believed they'd seen the children. Even the FBI were brought in. But still, the disappearance remained a mystery. Investigators found not one scrap of evidence, and the bodies of the boys were never recovered. Just days after the disappearance, the police chief at the time told the Fayetteville Observer, "We've checked every lead we've had, and we're still up against a blank wall." Days passed, then weeks, then months. Eventually, it became years, and there was no trace of the children. Carl Bock, the boys' stepfather, was an army sergeant at the time of the disappearance. He worked as a military police officer at Fort Bragg, but was sent overseas just a year after the children went missing. He and the boys' mother formally divorced shortly afterwards, and he remained unmarried throughout the rest of his life. Investigators have theorized that Bock was involved in the disappearance of Terry and Allan, and have suggested that the two were killed shortly after they went missing. In 2012, authorities attempted to re-interview Bock and even offered a letter of qualified immunity, but Bock declined. He told them, "If I hadn't been in the military police, that would be a pretty good proposition." Investigators later recalled that Bock seemed to be indifferent about the boys and their mother, with one officer noting, "It was clear he was devoid of any emotion in respect to those boys, and really, he was indifferent about Margie as well." The disappearance of the Westerfield brothers is the oldest case involving children in North Carolina. The vast majority of witnesses and those important to the case are now dead, including Terry and Allan's biological father, who was ruled out of the investigation early on, and who took his own life in 1978, and their mother, Margie, who, following her divorce from Bock, remarried and relocated to South Carolina, where she died in 2003 at the age of 70. Carl Bock was the last to pass away in 2016 at the age of 93. Similarly, the theatre where the boys disappeared has been demolished in the decades since. Despite the disappointing lack of leads and evidence in the case, Fayetteville police occasionally reopen the file and try to look at the investigation with fresh eyes, searching for a missing piece. Nothing yet has come from their efforts, however. New details emerged about the case in 2018, which puts more stock in the police theory that Carl Bock was responsible for the children's disappearance. According to investigators, the boys had been left with a babysitter on the morning of September 12, 1964, because Margie had a hair appointment. Reportedly, Carl Bock turned up at the house and told the babysitter to leave. The babysitter tried to stall and did so for some time before finally leaving at around 12:30 to 1 p.m. Around this time, 7-year-old Allan was seen riding his bike outside. A neighborhood boy and a friend of the children's went to the door to ask if Terry could come out to play. Bock answered the door and said no, that the 11-year-old was being punished. As mentioned earlier, Bock claimed that he later took the boys to see a double film feature. When Margie came home around an hour and a half later, at around 5:30, Bock was in the house and the boys were gone. The pair argued about Bock sending the babysitter home and him taking the boys out, but Margie didn't suspect that anything was amiss. She went out that night with friends. When she came home at 1 a.m., she argued again with Bock, who asked her if she'd picked the children up from the cinema because he allegedly couldn't find them. Margie phoned the police at 2 a.m. to report the boys missing. During an interview, the one where he was offered a letter of qualified immunity, Bock reportedly stated, "You know I was the last one to see them alive." Many police officers have taken this as a sort of confession, but still, Bock was never charged in connection to the case, and the bodies of Allan and Terry have never been discovered. Terry Westerfield was 11 when he vanished from Fayetteville, North Carolina on September 12, 1964. His brother, Allan, was just 7. Terry is described as being a white male with red hair and blue eyes, freckles on his face, and an appendectomy scar on his abdomen. He's also missing one permanent tooth in his lower jaw. He was 4'7" and weighed around 89 pounds when he vanished. His younger brother, Allan, is described as a white male with sandy brown hair, blue eyes, and a speech impediment. He was 3'10" and weighed around 80 pounds at the time of the disappearance. If you have any information about the disappearances of the Westerfield brothers, you can contact the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office at 910-323-1500. Carl Switzer. Born in 1927, Carl Dean Switzer rose to fame when he bagged the role of Alfalfa in the comedy short series Our Gang in the mid-1930s while still a child. Little did Carl know at the time, but Alfalfa would soon become the public's most beloved and best remembered character from the series, which portrayed the adventures of a ragtag group of friends. After leaving Our Gang in the 1940s, though, Carl struggled to find work. He remained in Hollywood, taking on small roles in movies like It's a Wonderful Life and appearing in B-movies, though he also became a dog breeder and trainer to help support himself and his family. In 1959, Carl agreed to train a treeing Walker Coonhound, a hunting dog, for a longtime friend of his named Moses Bud Stilts. The pair had met while working on several productions at the Corriganville Movie Ranch in California. However, things went awry when the dog ran off after a bear, and Carl failed to find the canine. After learning that his expensive hound was now missing, possibly gone forever, Stilts demanded that Carl return the dog or pay him the dog's worth. By this point in life, though, Carl was struggling financially and had recently gone through a divorce, so he was unable to pay Stilts outright to replace the dog. Instead, he turned to the newspapers and began taking out ads, asking for the canine's safe return in exchange for monetary compensation. The good news was that the dog was safely returned. The bad news was that Carl had to cough up $35, the modern-day equivalent of around $370 as a reward, along with $15 worth of alcoholic beverages, the equivalent of $160 today. A few days later, though, on January 21st, Carl was feeling sorrowful about the loss of his $50 and complained to a friend about the situation. He and his friend felt that Carl should be reimbursed the finder's fee because the dog belonged to Stilts, not him. They subsequently decided to go and speak with Stilts to settle the matter, arriving at his home in the neighborhood of Mission Hills, LA, shortly afterwards. Things didn't go to plan, however. Stilts was at some point struck over the left side of his head with a glass clock during the dispute, and in response, he grabbed his .38 caliber revolver, which Carl attempted to wrestle from him. Their struggle caused the gun to go off, narrowly missing Stilts' 14-year-old stepson. Stilts would later claim that Carl had banged on the door and demanded to be let into the home, and then events played out as previously stated. After the gun went off, Stilts alleged that Carl then grabbed a knife and yelled, "I'm going to kill you." Afraid for his life, Stilts shot the 31-year-old, damaging an artery and causing massive internal bleeding. Carl was pronounced dead at the hospital. Tom Corrigan, Stilts' stepson, who was almost shot that day, had a different version of events, however. He claimed that his stepfather shot Carl as he and his friend were leaving. Reportedly, Carl had turned to leave just after the gun went off during the struggle. Carl never brandished a knife nor threatened Stilts. Unfortunately, though, Tom was never called to testify during the coroner's inquest, and Stilts' version of events was considered the truth, despite the fact that Stilts had a previous conviction for perjury, and that numerous pieces of physical evidence did not make sense in the story he was telling. The shooting was determined to have been in self-defense, but Tom Corrigan stood by his version of events, and decades later, in 2001, he told reporters it was more like murder. He added that he'd also seen his stepfather threaten to kill Carl's friend after the murder, but was interrupted by the sound of sirens approaching the home. He believes this is the only reason why Carl's friend was able to leave with his life that night. Adrien Shelley. Adrien Shelley is known as an off-Broadway actress and for her roles in independent films like Trust and The Unbelievable Truth, which came out in 1990 and 1989, respectively. Over the following years, Adrien would take up small roles in several television shows like Law and Order and Oz, and would also snag major roles in various off-Broadway plays. Her final work before her death was a comedy drama film which she wrote, directed, and acted in, named Waitress. The film was critically acclaimed and, along with its cast, won 5 film awards, as well as various other nominations. It was turned into a Broadway show in 2015, where it was nominated for a Tony Award. Sadly, though, Adrien would never see the success of her work, as she was murdered in November 2006, before the film's release in 2007. Adrien was found dead on November 1st, 2006, at around 5:45 p.m. in the apartment she used as an office space in Abingdon Square, Manhattan. Her husband, Andy Ostroy, discovered her body after becoming concerned when he was unable to reach her throughout the day. He had dropped Adrien off at 9:30 that morning, and it was unusual for her to be out of contact for so long, especially as she was waiting on some exciting news about whether or not her film Waitress would be shown at the Sundance Festival. Andy found Adrien hanging from the shower rod in the bathroom, a bedsheet around her neck. Adrien's post-mortem revealed that her cause of death was neck compression, and that she'd been dead for around 5 to 6 hours before she was found. At first, investigators believed that the 40-year-old had taken her own life. Andy, though, was not convinced. Not only did Adrien not suffer from depression or other mental health issues, but she was also very excited about her film project and was a devoted mother to her daughter, who was just 2 at the time of her death. Andy found it difficult to grasp the reasoning of the police, especially when he pointed out that there was money missing from Adrien's purse, an unidentified shoe print on the toilet lid, and the door was unlocked. Andy was, by all accounts, unconvinced by the police's version of events. He flat out told the media that his wife did not kill herself. He then began to pressure investigators into re-examining the bathroom and taking a look at the evidence he'd pointed out, in the hopes they'd take him seriously and realize that something didn't add up. To the media, he said of his daughter, "That little girl has to know, has to grow up knowing the truth." Investigators soon realized that Andy was right. They discovered that the shoe print belonged to a Reebok Allen inversion-style trainer in a men's size 8. This didn't match any of Adrien's shoes, nor did it match those of Andy or any medics who'd attended the scene. Over the next few days, detectives began interviewing those who knew the 40-year-old, eventually learning of an aspiring writer who had been pestering Adrien to read his screenplay. Police noted, quote, "It seems that he was very frustrated with Adrien, constantly trying to get her attention, but she wasn't having any of it." Interestingly, when they went out to speak with this writer, law enforcement discovered that he'd moved out and left the country. This was, of course, incredibly suspicious, but upon closer inspection, detectives learned that he'd left the US before Adrien's death. Authorities were right back at square one, with no leads and no real suspects. On November 5th, 4 days after the murder, investigators revisited the crime scene. They discovered that there was construction going on the floor directly above where Adrien's department was located, and decided to check out the area. It was here, in one empty apartment, its floor covered with construction paper, that the police found a dusty shoe print that looked awfully familiar. Law enforcement turned to the foreman, Wilson Pilko. At his home, they noticed a backpack with a pair of trainers inside that looked like the Reeboks they were searching for. When asked about them, Wilson stated they belonged to his younger brother, 19-year-old Diego Pilko, who was a construction worker. The shoes were soon found to be a match to the prints found in Adrien's bathroom. When confronted by investigators, Pilko claimed that he'd been in the building, but he didn't know Adrien and hadn't been in her office. Then he changed his story. He alleged that Adrien had complained about the construction noise and he'd thrown a hammer in her direction, worried she would complain and that he'd lose his job and home because he was in the US illegally. He followed her back to her office. He claimed that Adrien hit him first, and then he had retaliated by punching her in the face and knocking her to the ground. She had subsequently hit her head on the way down and was knocked unconscious. Believing he had killed her, Pilko staged the hanging in the bathroom. However, investigators knew this story was incorrect because Adrien had not suffered a blow to the head, and her cause of death was neck compression. At his trial in 2008, Pilko changed his story again. He claimed that he decided to rob Adrien after noticing her while on his lunch break. However, he was caught in the act, and so Pilko put his hand over her mouth to quiet her screaming, rendering her unconscious. Afterwards, he bound a bedsheet around her neck and strangled her. Pilko subsequently dragged Adrien's body to the bathroom and staged the suicide. Pilko pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was given 25 years in prison without parole. Since he is in the US illegally, he will be deported to Ecuador upon his release. Christa Helm. Christa Helm is likely not a name you know. A struggling actress, her career in Hollywood mostly consisted of bit parts in the likes of Wonder Woman and Starsky and Hutch in the 1970s. But despite her mediocre career, Christa was a popular woman. She was often at the biggest parties, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Mick Jagger, all while contemplating where to take her career next. On the night of February 11th, 1977, 27-year-old Christa attended a party in the neighborhood of Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles, with her roommate, Stephanie. Stephanie would later report that, during the party, Christa approached me with a funny, cloudy look on her face. When she asked the actress what was wrong, she was told it was nothing. Quote, "But I could tell something had shaken her. I'll never forget that look." Stephanie left the party shortly afterwards as she was going to see her boyfriend. She gave her car keys to Christa and then left. This was the last time she saw her friend and roommate alive. She attempted to contact Christa by calling their home later that night from a payphone, but received no answer. She knew in her gut that something was amiss. Christa's body was found in the early hours of February 12th. She was in West Hollywood, as after the party she had gone to see a friend, Sandy Smith, a music agent who had been invited to the party but had declined to attend because he was tired and wanted an early night. Christa's body was partially beneath a parked car that belonged to Sandy's girlfriend Nancy, who lived with him, though she was reportedly not there that night. A homicide detective who was called to the scene, Larry Brandenburg, told Oxygen's Mysteries and Scandals, quote, "It was an older but somewhat exclusive neighborhood. I think Christa might have known someone was chasing or following her because she stopped fast in her car. We know that she exited the car, had a heated conversation with someone, and before she was able to return to her car, she was attacked." He added that neighbors heard blood-curdling screams that sounded like a cat being skinned. Christa's death was horrifically violent. She bore 23 stab wounds to her front, back, neck, and on the side of her head. She also had defensive injuries to her hands. Immediately, authorities did not suspect that this was a random encounter. Given the level of violence and brutality inflicted on the 27-year-old, they believed she knew her killer. Furthermore, Christa's handbag was missing from the scene. This led to speculation that whoever had killed her had been after her now infamous diary, which she reportedly kept in her possession at all times. The diary is said to have contained the names of men and women she had sexual encounters with, and allegedly included a rating system. Most of her friends knew of the diary, and they had reportedly warned her off it, worried it would land her in trouble. Some thought she was going to turn it into a book. Others feared she was going to attempt to extort Hollywood's elite. Chillingly, she sent a postcard to a friend before she died, which said, quote, "I am in way over my head here. I'm into something I can't get out of." She had also written a letter to a friend a few months earlier, in which she stated she was into something deep and may disappear for a while. Still, the first line of inquiry followed by detectives was the idea that her death was potentially connected to that of the actor Sal Mineo, who was stabbed to death in 1976 at the age of 37. Chillingly, His murder came exactly 1 year earlier and had occurred in West Hollywood. At the time, investigators determined that the cases weren't linked, as the perpetrator in the Menino case was in prison at the time of Christa's death. However, decades later, they'd realized that the killer, 21-year-old Lionel Williams, was not arrested until after the 27-year-old's death. Some detectives still believe Williams was responsible for Christa's murder. Investigators struggled to make sense of Christa's personal life, and they failed to find solid leads. Without the notebook that kept track of all her relationships, they found it difficult to know where to start, especially as nobody wanted to discuss or admit to their relationship with the 27-year-old. Detectives also discovered that Christa had audio recorded many of her sexual encounters, but those tapes have also never been recovered. They were allegedly taken by another fledgling actor at the time, Tony Sirico, in the days following her death. Although Christa's roommate noticed the theft and informed the police, Sirico was never interviewed until years later, at which point he denied everything. Eventually, the case grew cold. It wasn't until 2008 that it was reopened at the behest of Christa's only daughter, Nicole, who was just 9 when her mother died. During this fresh look at the case, one man did come to the attention of police. Rudy Mazzella was a partygoer who attended many of the same parties Christa did. He was a known drug dealer with a violent reputation, too. Police found that back in 1977, a woman whose boyfriend was close to Mazzella had told detectives, quote, "My boyfriend told me that Rudy had told him that he had murdered Christa." She added that he did not provide a motive for the killing. Though Mazzella was questioned, he denied everything and the lead went nowhere. He died in the early 2000s, before the case was reopened. Investigators still suspect that Christa's book and/or the audio tapes are the reason she wound up dead. They have also speculated that jealousy may be a part of it, that she had a relationship with someone who was already taken, or perhaps somebody didn't like that she was uninterested in exclusivity. One woman who had a sexual relationship with Christa, a backup singer named Patty Collins, was known to have fled town the day after the murder. However, she later told the police that she was afraid for her life. She worried that Christa was killed for something she knew, and whoever killed her would think the 27-year-old had revealed the secret to Patty. In 2008, a DNA profile was made using the sample found beneath Christa's fingernails at the time of her death. Notably, the profile is that of a woman. Still, no matches have been found so far. Anyone with information about Christa's murder can contact the Homicide Cold Case Unit at the LA County Sheriff's Department at 323-890-5500. Kelly Nolan. On June 22, 2007, 22-year-old Kelly Nolan, a student at the University of Wisconsin, went out for a night of drinking with a group of friends in her town of Madison. Notably, Kelly had a history with alcohol, often relying on it when her emotions were challenging. She had lost her father in 2006, and just a month before her disappearance, her stepmother passed away. Between 2004 and 2007, Kelly was convicted of drunk driving twice, which led to her license being suspended. She also spent 14 days in county jail for one of these offenses. But on the night of June 22nd, Kelly was determined to have a good time. Later in the night, her friends were ready to go home, but Kelly wanted to keep partying, so she split from the group at around 11:30 p.m. Kelly remained at a bar named the Lava Lounge on West Gilman Street, about half a mile from her apartment, where she continued talking with a young man she'd met. The young man would later reveal to investigators that he didn't know Kelly, but they'd hit it off at the bar and talked for a good portion of the night. According to this unidentified individual, he was going to walk Kelly home because she was being harassed by another patron, who was possibly a man she knew. Tom Paris, another bar owner and the employer of the young man who was talking to Kelly that night, recalled, "The guy was giving her the creeps." Before they went home, though, Kelly asked the young man to wait while she used the restroom. She was seen shortly afterwards interacting with the man who'd harassed her that night. Tom Paris observed they were both very drunk, and he admits he was stupid to have left her there when he saw her talking to that guy again outside, but he assumed they were friends. This was the last time the young man saw Kelly. After he came forward to the police, he provided them with a DNA sample and underwent polygraph testing. Both his house and car were subject to extensive searches, but investigators found nothing. He has been cleared of involvement in Kelly's disappearance. Kelly called her sister in the small hours of June 23rd while still at the bar, but failed to return home that night. She was never seen or heard from again. The 22-year-old's body was discovered several weeks later on June 9th. It was located in a wooded area on the property of an elderly woman in the 4700 block of Schneider Drive in Oregon, Wisconsin, about 10 miles from where Kelly lived in Madison. Investigators believe that she died where she was found, and a post-mortem revealed that Kelly's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the torso, which led to bone fractures. There is some speculation that she was hit by a vehicle on purpose, although this doesn't appear to have been confirmed to the media. Kelly's case has been at a standstill since 2007, though there have been attempts to reinvestigate it over the years. When she was last seen, she was wearing jeans and an emerald green scoop-necked top. Investigators are looking to speak with the witnesses who saw her on the night of her murder. If you have any information about Kelly's case, you can call the Madison Area Crime Stoppers at 608-266-6014. Dana Bailey. On March 4th, 1987, 21-year-old Dana Bailey called her parents to let them know that she'd just returned home to State College, Pennsylvania, where she was a student at Pennsylvania University. She had been out of town for a while, visiting her fiancé in Washington, D.C. Her parents, relieved to hear that she was home safe, said goodbye and hung up shortly afterwards. The next day, Dana's mother decided to drop by her daughter's apartment on South Allen Street, but was horrified to find the 21-year-old dead from multiple stab wounds in her second-floor apartment. Dana had been stabbed 6 to 7 times in her left breast, and she was naked, tied up, and blindfolded. Authorities believe that she was killed in her bed and then moved, where she was posed on top of bedding and sheets spread out across the floor. Her body was visible from her bedroom window. The murder weapon, meanwhile, was established as being a steak knife from Dana's kitchen. It had not been brought in by the killer. Investigators struggled to find leads at first. Dana was well-liked and friendly. She had no known enemies and was happily engaged. But then they discovered that somebody was watching the 21-year-old's apartment from a building that was being remodeled. Inside a room looking into Dana's home, they found shoe prints which matched those found in her apartment. Notably, 3 other apartments on Dana's floor were empty on the night of her murder, and her roommate was out for the night. This led to speculation that whoever was watching Dana had been doing so for some time, as he knew the comings and goings of those in the building well enough to plan his assault accordingly. Authorities determined that the unidentified individual had gained access to Dana's apartment through a kitchen window that faced the area where he surveyed her. Despite managing to establish all of this, and despite interviewing dozens of individuals and following hundreds of leads, investigators simply could not identify the culprit behind Dana's horrific murder. In 1991, a third party came forward with a tip. The third party relayed information divulged to them by a man who would not speak with the police because he was a wanted criminal. Investigators learned of a possible suspect who was a heating contractor in 1987. It was noted that he would have been familiar with the rooftops near Dana's apartment due to his work. The suspect was further described as being 5'10" and white, with dark curly hair. He drove a gold or bronze Pontiac Trans Am with stripes. Though investigators pursued this line of inquiry, nothing seems to have come from it, and it's unclear if the individual was ever identified. Then, in December 2003, investigators received an anonymous letter. Dana's case had been dormant for years, and it seemed like, finally, there was a break in the case. A chance for law enforcement to pin down a suspect once and for all. While the letter did mention the names of 2 individuals, detectives have been unable to connect them to Dana or her case. Authorities asked the letter writer to step forward so they could question them further about some of their statements, but it doesn't appear that they ever did. Dana's case is still unsolved. If you have any information about her death, you can contact State College Police at 814-234-7150. Tammy Zawicki. In the days before 21-year-old Tammy Zawihi's disappearance, she was having trouble with her car. A student of Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa, Tammy had spent her summer studying in Madrid, Spain. As the summer break neared its end, she and her brother left their home in New Jersey for a road trip back to their respective schools. They would stop off in Pittsburgh to visit family, and then head to Evanston, Illinois, to drop off Darren at his university. Tammy planned to continue the trip alone back to Grinnell afterwards. However, during the trip, Tammy's white Pontiac failed them several times. At one point, Darren believed he'd sorted out the issue, and they arrived in Illinois on August 22, 1992. After staying with a friend overnight, Tammy prepared to go on her solo trip. Darren checked her engine one final time before waving her off. Tammy didn't make it far before the Pontiac began having trouble again. Over 60 witnesses saw her looking under the hood of the vehicle that afternoon at mile marker 83 on Interstate 80 in central Illinois. According to authorities, around 26 cars stopped by to check on the 21-year-old during this time. Tammy never made it to Grinnell. She was due to contact her parents and let them know she'd arrived safely, but she never did, and since they failed to reach her, they reported her missing. By the time the police began looking into the disappearance several days later, however, her car had been towed and could not be tested for fingerprints due to a chain of custody failure. Still, the vehicle showed no signs of a struggle, and inside the car, her handbag and camera remained. Soon, eyewitnesses began to come forward. An Iowa truck driver named Robert Bullington told investigators that he had seen Tammy get into a gray Chevrolet Celebrity with a male driver. He reportedly spoke with the driver, who said that Tammy's car had overheated. Bullington subsequently advised the man to stop at a truck stop in LaSalle, but no witnesses could place Tammy at the truck stop. Other witnesses placed a tractor-trailer truck next to the Pontiac when she was last seen at around 3:10 and 4 o'clock that afternoon. The truck has been described as having a faded, rusty orange strip around the center, while the driver was dark-haired, white, around 6 foot tall, and between the ages of 35 and 40. Tammy's body was recovered on September 1st, 1992. She was badly decomposed and on the side of a rural stretch of Interstate Highway 44 in Lawrence County, Missouri. She was identified through dental records and still wore the clothing she had on when she vanished. Her body was discovered by a trucker who'd pulled over to the side of the road, stating at different times that he had done so to urinate or to pull tarp over the truck bed in preparation for the rain. He noticed a foul smell upon exiting his vehicle and soon found the remains. Tammy had been wrapped in a red blanket and had been stabbed 7 to 8 times. Her post-mortem noted that the wounds had been made in a circle around her heart, which was most unusual, and that they'd been made using a small, sharp object which had led to internal bleeding. Though her clothing was intact, some reports, including one from the FBI, report that Tammy was sexually assaulted before her death. Her watch was missing from the scene. It played the tune of Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head and had a green umbrella on its face. Investigators have theorized that Tammy was killed elsewhere and that the perpetrator drove her across Illinois and into Missouri before dumping her body 500 miles from where she vanished. In the days following the discovery of the body, a task force was established, made up of 14 investigators who were a mix of local authorities and FBI agents. In the subsequent weeks, they identified several suspects, the most notable of which was Lonnie Bierbrot, a trucker and convicted felon who was out on parole at the time of Tammy's death. He was questioned in early 1993, and investigators discovered that he had gifted his wife with a watch that looked similar to the one missing from Tammy's body. Furthermore, he was identified by a witness as the man she saw near Tammy's Pontiac on the day of her disappearance, and he lived not far from where the body was located in September. However, he could never be linked physically to the case. The watch he reportedly gave his wife was never recovered, and he died in 2002. Several other suspects came and went, but all of them were ruled out. For decades, the case has been almost dormant, although podcasters, armchair detectives, and Tammy's family have all been attempting to look for answers and shed light on the case. In 2020, serial killer Clark Perry Baldwin was arrested. Baldwin was responsible for the murders of 3 women between 1983 and 1997 across the states of Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, and Nevada. Following his arrest, a retired investigator suggested Baldwin could be responsible for Tammy's death because her killing fits the profile of his previous murders. However, law enforcement has stated that he is not considered a suspect in the case. Tammy's case is still unsolved. If you have any information about her murder, you can call the Illinois State Police at 815-726-6377 or the FBI's Chicago office at 312-421-6700. Tips can be submitted anonymously to the FBI at the website tips.fbi.gov. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own thoughts and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.